Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku was chosen by the gods part 2. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 3, comment down below. And let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story SweetBbyFox from AUu-centric. So let's start the video. Prince Katsuki, you are looking so on fleek, Kami sobbed, bringing a silk handkerchief up to her eyes and dabbed gently. Shouto side-eyed her, his arms crossed over his chest. What the hell does on fleek mean? She smirked through the handkerchief over her shoulder and stood in front of Shouto, a dainty finger on his chest, as she purred. I could describe you as on fleek, Shouto. He swatted her hand away from him, while Izuku watched them with wide eyes. His face flushed. Prince Katsuki scoffed from in front of him, so Izuku brought his focus back to the dragon prince with slightly shaky hands. He fixed the collar on the prince's shirt. Don't fucking look so awkward and jealous, you idiot, the prince whispered to Izuku. Kami is just being stupid, okay? She's not actually interested in your familiar, so relax, goddamn. Ooh, Izuku breathed, his face turning an even darker shade of pink. He stepped back and gave Prince Katsuki a look. Over an hour earlier, Shouto and Kami had used their yokai powers combined to essentially make Prince Katsuki appear human with Shouto's shapeshifting abilities, which Izuku was very excited to find out about. Who knew he could change other people like that? And Kami's illusions. It was very believable that Prince Katsuki was a regular human. His horns were gone, and his skin lacked all the markings and tattoos from before, besides one of the red dragon tattoos on his right arm. Izuku let him borrow some of his own clothing, which was weird to see. But the prince, even as a human, was incredibly handsome. Izuku noted that he looked much better in the orange button-up than he ever did, especially with the sleeves rolled up above the elbows and exposing his strong forearms. The prince took a look into a tall mirror that Ochako and Tsuyu held up together. He scowled at his reflection, lifting his face up to examine himself. I look like a weak ass, he muttered, his cheeks turning slightly pink as he shoved his hands into the pockets of the jeans he wore. This is humiliating. Kami shushed him, gently patting his fluffy blonde hair. Oh shush. Now you look totally on point. Iaru is going to swoon when he sees you. But remember, Shouto sighed as he moved to stand beside Izuku. You cannot use any yokai powers. If you do, the transformation will immediately wear off and you'll reveal yourself as a dragon yokai. I heard you the first time, half and half. Prince Katsuki spat. I get it, no powers. His voice softened unsurely. He pouted down at the black shoes he wore. Kami swung an arm around his shoulder, her bells ringing, as she pulled the prince close to her. Don't worry, your highness will watch you close to make sure you're safe. He shoved her away, then headed for the door. Let's just fucking go before I end up late, or some shit. Iaru was really excited, nervous, yes, but mostly super excited. Had been thinking about the blind date nonstop since the odd but kind of endearing freckled guy had showed up to arrange it. For months now, his best friends had been bugging him nonstop about reaching out and dating someone. He thought back to one night a month before when they'd all been drinking and relaxing together. Ah, you're so cute, his best friend Mina had shrieked. You're putting that cute face and sexy body to waste. Get out there and date someone. Hanta had nodded in agreement, lifting his beer to the ceiling. Cheers to that. It's a shame your cute face is going to waste. Iaru, what about my cute face? Denki had asked, to which the others just laughed. Kirishima put a strong hand on his friend's shoulder. I think your face is also cute, bro, had said with a toothy grin. Hey now, don't try to win me over, it's too late, Denki had said with a dreamy sigh. You know my eyes are set on one person. Iaru barked out a loud laugh. Maybe someday you'll be in the front row of one of her concerts, and she'll notice you. I believe in you, Denki. I swear I'm going to meet her someday. And she'll fall for me too. You'll see. The blonde grinned as he pointed to the poster on his wall. Wait for me, Kayuka. Someday it'll be yours. Crazily enough, Denki did meet her, and she even hung out with all of them a few times. Iaru was really happy for Denki and the others. It was some good luck that they got a job at the stadium she usually performed concerts at. He was a little bummed that they all got a job together while he still was stuck at the boba cafe, but he did get better pay and tips, so he tried to not feel too jealous of his friends. He felt his phone vibrate from his pocket as he walked down the street towards the park. Had agreed to meet this Katsuki guy at it. Buzzed 2 more times as he pulled it out, frowning as he noticed how clammy his hands were. Iaru gritted his teeth and let out a cool hiss of air. Relax, man, he said to himself as he opened up his text messages. You got this. The first text was from Mina to their group chat. Pinky, you getting ready for our date? Are you so excited? Cause I am. We love you and believe in you. Iaru smiled softly at his phone. He was so lucky to have had a best friend like Mina for so many years. After her text were messages from Hanta and Denki. Hanta, it's true, blow him away, dude. Denki, blow him, lolo stoop. Iaru cried aloud and threw his head back with a groan, his entire face heating up miserably before he could reply. Hanta and Mina had already. Hanta, that's not what I meant, but sure, whatever works for you. Iaru, Elmao, Pinky. Denki, don't be gross, hahaha Pinky. Though they're right, like whatever works for you, But just so you know, you deserve more than a quick fling thing. Denki, yup, you deserve to be fine-dined Hanta. Then 69D Denki, lol Pinky, you stop, hahaha We are sorry, he let out another embarrassed moan, and then quickly typed out his reply. I guess I am on my way now, so wish me luck. I also, you're all the worst. But I still love you, Hanta, love you man, have fun, good luck Denki. Just don't forget about me, your first and only true love, lol Pinky. I love you the most, I have so much fun, take pics if you can K. He checked the time before shoving his phone back into jeans, and then quickened his pace. His bright red hair was spiked high and proud like he usually did it. And he wore one of his favorite outfits, dark blue jeans, and a cropped long-sleeve red top that showed off his abs nicely with his comfiest red Crocs. Iaru snuck a glance at his reflection as he passed a shop window and paused for a moment. God. He was so scared. Ijuru Kirishima wanted to be manly, the manliest. But if he was being honest with himself, he was so scared of being disliked, scared of being alone, scared of losing once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, and living a life with nothing to be proud of. He suddenly thought back to the only relationship he'd ever had. It was in high school, and had lasted only 2 months. She was a really sweet, funny girl who laughed really loud and liked to tease him. It was fun being with her. They had some really exciting dates like indoor rock climbing, and they'd once ran a marathon together. Ijuru considered himself adventurous. And if anything, she was even more adventurous than he was. It was super rad. And then he took her to their school dance. She looked beautiful and definitely grabbed the attention of others. But instead of feeling Jalaush was proud of her, she was confident and strong, and he felt so lucky to be taking her to that dance. Had gone to get drinks for her and her friend that was tagging along with them. But when he came back, the girls were surrounded by 4 boys a year older than them. His girlfriend looked angry, glaring ferociously at the tallest of the boys, while her friend looked anxious and small beside her. His girlfriend had spotted him and immediately called out from him, Ijuru, tell these creeps to get lost. But when the boys turned to face him, he froze up with fear. There was no way he could take on 4 guys that were older and probably stronger than him. He began to tremble as they got closer, their ugly grins huge and intimidating as they laughed at him. They mocked him, called him small and weak, and all he could do was quiver like a deer in headlights. One of them pushed him to the ground, while another kicked him in the stomach. He didn't fight back, he just covered his face and hoped the girls were able to get away unnoticed. Soon a teacher was notified and got the gang off of him. He left the dance alone, bruised, and with a humiliating text that said, girlfriend, thanks for nothing, Ijuru. I can't be with a coward like you, delete my number, because we're done, it hurt. But he didn't blame her. Ijuru had done nothing to defend her or himself. But from that day forth, he worked hard to be stronger, manlier, and hopefully someone who can stand up for others when they need help. Hopefully Ijuru Kirishima, he said to his reflection, firmly ignoring the odd stares he got from passers-by that happened to hear him yelling, you are a man now, a strong man, a brave man, a man who has a date, so get out there and kick some ass. And at the very least make a new friend today. With one last final pound to his chest to get himself really pumped, he marched away from the window to head for the park. How far away is this fucking place? Prince Katsuki growled, raucously, his head low and back bent forward as he walked with hands deep in the pockets of the jeans he was borrowing. We're almost there. Izuku sighed. I picked out a section of the park that's a little more private, so that you don't gather too much attention. Even though you look human, you're still a little loud. He was rewarded with a fierce glare and hard shove that almost sent him tumbling into the road. If Shouto hadn't grabbed him, Shouto continued walking, while holding Izuku close to his chest, almost dragging him along as he said to the prince in a flat voice, I'd appreciate it if you didn't touch my god, your highness. Prince Katsuki repeated Shouto, but with a high-pitched mocking voice, I'd appreciate it if you didn't touch my god, your highness. Shut the fuck up, icy hot goddamn. Izuku gently pushed himself away from Shouto and motioned for the prince to quiet down. We're almost there, he said, hushed, trying not to let his amusement show. Well, hide over here. While Prince Katsuki, you can find Ijuru at one of the benches. I'm sure he'll be here any minute. Now Shouto, Izuku, and Kami all hurried over behind some trees where they could watch the Dragon Prince in secret. While he headed over to an empty bench and sat himself down, Ijuru could feel his body physically losing all tension, calming down like a deep, relaxing exhale as he walked deeper into the park and farther away from the busier, crowded parts, usually the area with playgrounds and screaming children. This part of the park was surrounded by trees and shrubbery and the occasional street lamp that was turned on, but not quite effective with the sun still up. There was a cool breeze in the air, one he was grateful for, because he was warm with the nerves of a first date. His revealed stomach tickled as the cold air hit it. But the sensation was pleasant. He looked ahead as he walked, his heart pounding loudly. But steadily Ijuru could sense it soon he would meet this Katsuki person that for the life of him he just could not remember meeting as a child. Maybe it would come back to him when he met the guy. Who knows? Either way, this was exciting. And he was also really just happy to be out in such a beautiful park. At the top of a small hill was a simple wooden bench, and on it facing away from the path was single person, their hair blonde and fluffy. Looking from the short distance, Iaru stopped, looked around. And when seeing there was no one else around, he decided to take his chance that this guy was his blind date. He walked up the short hill, making sure his steps were a noticeable volume to hopefully not startle the man. Katsuki, he said a little hesitantly, coming around the side of the bench to sit by the stranger who turned to face him. A pair of bold and ferocious and incredibly sexy fiery red eyes widened as Iaru could feel his own eyes open more as he and the man stared at each other. God damn it. He was so screwed high, he breathed out, completely unashamed of his breathless state. Because damn, this man was beautiful. But the spell all but vanished as the man replied in a bewildered gasp, his cheeks noticeably pink. What the fuck is up with your hair? Unoffended, Iaru barked out a loud laugh and scooted himself closer on the bench, putting his arm on the edge just behind the man, but not touching. Rather than move away, Katsuki inched himself closer too, so that their knees were touching. Iaru swore he was burning through his jeans, the small contact making all of his insides buzz happily. He had to consciously keep himself still as his body wanted to shake with excitement. Do you like it? He asked cheekily. The man glared angrily at him. And yet, despite his harsh words, his blushing face gave himself away. No, your hair is shitty, he grumbled. Iaru could only laugh more as he leaned back against the bench and grinned. Katsuki stared at him, a tiny fond smirk on his pink face. As they chatted contentedly with one another for several minutes, there was a sudden gurgling sound that came from Katsuki's stomach. He looked genuinely offended as he scowled down at his lap. Iaru smiled kindly and patted Katsuki's arm lightly, trying not to grin at how strong and manly his biceps were. Listen, there's this amazing crepe stand at the other side of the park. I'll go grab us a couple, okay? He stood up quickly, shot the blonde a quick thumbs up before literally running away from the bewildered man. Iaru sprinted for a good minute or two before slowing down, smacking his cheeks hard as he groaned, I can't believe I ran away from him. Things were going so well too. While embarrassed with himself, he also was honestly really relieved to get away for a moment. So far things were going great. But he did not expect Katsuki to be that attractive. His tattoos were totally badass, his obviously fit body was incredibly distracting, and holy hell, his constant grumpy face was the cutest fucking thing Iaru had ever seen. If Iaru didn't control himself, his libido was going to take over and he'd be tackling the poor man to the ground. Of course, only if said man reciprocated such passionate feelings, because consent was the top priority for a manly man like I. The line for the crepes was short, so he was able to order 2 strawberry Nutella crepes, let's hope Katsuki likes it, and start heading back relatively quickly. He didn't run back as it would be super crappy to drop the crepes, but he did sort of skip along to get back to Katsuki faster. Iaru was really thrilled. He hadn't felt this good about a date in probably forever. Maybe they could go out again soon. Would he like hiking? What kinds of food does he like? How would he react if Iaru tried to kiss him? Oh god. It would probably be stupid cute. Stuck to Iaru's face was a lovesick sappy grin. But he just couldn't stop himself from feeling so damn good. But then his heart sank into his stomach, and all of the blissful thoughts in his head froze in horror. There was a soft plop as he dropped the crepes from both of his hands. The memory of the high school dance, rushing at him like a truck, and leaving his body shaking in fear. Katsuki was chest to chest with a taller, heavier man, while 3 other large men surrounded them. His eyes were ablaze in anger, his fists up and raised and voice loud as he told the men to fuck off. But when Katsuki looked past the man, his eyes locking with Iaru's, he felt an awful desperation. There was an undeniable fear in those ferocious eyes, silently calling out for help. Iaru's eyes watered. I can't, he whispered, taking a single heavy step backwards. We have to help him, Kami hissed in despair, her tail puffy, and little cat ears pointed straight up as she attempted to get past Shouto, who held her back with his arms around her waist. He can't fight them as a human. He can't use his powers. He won't stand a chance. Just wait, he huffed. And then looked to Izuku. I want to see what Iaru does. Izuku lowered his body and peeked through the branches of the shrubbery, searching for Iaru. He watched the young red-haired man go, still dropping what looked to be crepes or some kind of chocolatey dessert. Help him, Izuku whispered. Why are you just standing there? He gulped loudly as he watched Iaru take a step back, pulling at his own curly hair in stress. No, what are you doing, you idiot? Shouto put Kami down and came up behind Izuku, placing a reassuring hand on his back gently. Why don't you help him? He frowned as the land god. You are meant to be a matchmaker. Have some faith in yourself. How? Izuku looked back at Shouto. You don't even have faith in me. I have faith in you, just not in them, the fox yokai clarified. But remember, Izuku, I want to be wrong. Shouto. Maybe the fox peered at Katsuki, who was starting to shove at the men. Then his eyes flickered back over to a very pale Iaru. Iaru Kirishima is scared. Could it be he just needs a little push? Izuku bit his lip and stared at Shouto for another second before his eyes widened in realization. That's it. He stood up straight and squeezed Shouto's shoulders. Thank you, I'll be right back. Where are you going? Kami squealed, grabbing at Shouto for comfort. He patted her head awkwardly as they watched the land god dash around the bushes and out of sight. Izuku pulled out a talisman and brush from his jacket pockets, quickly writing. As he ran, he curved around the path, stopping only when he was a few feet behind where Iaru was frozen in place. Izuku brought the talisman to his chest. And then with both hands he released it into the air. It fluttered straight for the redhead's back, glowing warmly as it landed. Its words were large and bold, the message clear as Iaru began to take steps forwards. "You can do it." Iaru's hands balled into fists as he suddenly charged for the men, a ridiculous roar escaping his mouth as he swung his arm back and punched the closest man hard in the jaw. The man fell over in surprise, causing alarm in the other men. Katsuki's face split into a devilish grin as he too sent his fist straight into one of the other men's face. There was a sickening crunch as Katsuki's fist made contact with the man's nose. Katsuki and Iaru stood back to back, arms raised protectively and ready to fight. The man Katsuki punched held his nose as blood dripped from beneath his fingers. "Fuck this shit. Let's get out of here before the cops or someone else shows up." He received nods of agreement, and the four men cowardly fled down the path. Izuku sank to his knees, letting out a breath of relief as he watched Iaru spin Katsuki around and check him for injuries. Katsuki only laughed, grabbed Iaru's face, and gave him a loud wet kiss. The kisses quickly multiplied, turning sloppy as their hands began to grab at each other frantically, and Izuku turned away with an embarrassed blush, almost walking straight into Shouto. "You got them together," Shouto said, his lips slightly upturned with amusement as he grabbed Izuku to stop him from stumbling more. A giggle escaped Izuku's throat there, a bit eager though, "Aren't they?" He only nodded, then asked Izuku, "How long is Prince Katsuki going to be under that disguise? Their relationship won't last. If it's built on lies, we'll have to wait and see." The freckled boy agreed. "But I have faith in them, I know." They waved goodbye to Kami, who stayed behind to secretly watch over her prince and Iaru, and headed back to the shrine. Things were comfortable. A few more weeks had passed since Izuku had gotten Prince Katsuki and Iaru together. He hadn't heard much from the two, but he assumed no news was good news. The only thing he did know was that the Dragon Prince planned to stay in his human form for as long as possible. He was happy for them, but he could tell Shouto was still slightly unsupportive of the new couple. Prince Katsuki has been lying to Iaru the entire time. Izuku sighed. Shouto had randomly brought up the couple on multiple occasions. Each time Izuku simply shrugged him off. "I know that, Shouto," he replied with a slight frown. "But that's not our business, and I'm sure Prince Katsuki will tell him eventually." Sure. A pair of mismatched eyes stared at Izuku with complete trepidation. "When the prince outlives him, maybe." The freckled boy simply rolled his eyes and stood up from the table. "God, you're so dramatic." Sometimes his tone wasn't completely sincere, and the small smirk on his lips gave away his true attitude. Shouto responded coolly, a small amused smile on his own face. "At least I don't cry over everything." "Hey!" Izuku cried out as his cheeks turned pink, sending a pout to the eavesdropping shrine spirits, who giggled shamelessly at the two's playful banter. "That was unfair, 𝗵𝗃." Shouto stood up as well and cut Izuku off from the kitchen entryway. He gently took Izuku's dirty bowl from his hands and leaned down close. His bangs grazed Izuku's cheek, his warm breath tickled his ear and sent the shivering boy's heart racing as he whispered in a honeyed voice, "We're not known for playing fair." Izuku realized then that he was fucked. "Izuku, if you don't relax your face, soon I'm scared you're going to shit yourself," Hanta bluntly said, as he poked the green-haired boy in the side with a broom. "Sorry." He half smiled as he rubbed the back of his head. "Just have a lot on my mind today, Uwa." Mina squealed, immediately dropping the rag she was wiping a window with, and skipped over to Izuku and Hanta. "Does it have anything to do with a certain handsome red and white-haired boy?" Izuku hid his burning face behind his hands. "It's not like that." Hanta grinned, wrapping an arm around Izuku's shoulder. "You can talk to us. Yes, we are nosy, but we also genuinely care. Plus, I wasn't kidding about your face. You really did look like you had to poop suo. I think it may be best for you to spit out whatever is on your mind." With a sigh, Izuku tilted his head back and rested it on Hanta's arm that stayed around him. Mina hurried over to hug Izuku to her arms wrapped tightly around both boys. "Oh, Izuku, honey, it's gotta be hard living with someone as pretty as Shouto. How do you do it?" she cooed, gently rubbing Izuku's cheeks with one of her hands. Hanta bit his lip to hide his amusement, while Izuku just groaned more honestly. "It can be really hard," he cried in defeat. "And he's so confusing. Sometimes he seems really cold, and sometimes I kind of think he might be flirting with me. I don't know what to think. We have advice." Mina smiled, her own cheek now pressed against Izuku's. She pulled Hanta, and so he was pressed against Izuku's other side. The black-haired boy nodded and added, "Our advice will probably be like opposite. But it's nice to get two different perspectives, right? And if you're really smart, you'll listen to neither of us." He threw in a friendly wink at the end. Izuku laughed warmly, causing all three of them to slightly jostle with him. "Sure, I'm happy to hear what you guys think I should do." Mina moved away first, boldly dashing away from the two boys and climbing up onto side table. The wooden legs wobbled slightly as she straightened up, but she stood confidently with her hands on her hips. She pointed a long finger at Izuku. The sparkly pink nail polish that decorated her fingers dazzled dramatically as she gleamed. "My advice to you, sweet Izuku Midoriya," she yelled, her volume definitely louder than she should have been, "is to play hard to make this guy want you, flirt and tease. but keep yourself an arm's reach away. Then you and your adorable face will be irresistible. Shouto won't know what hit him. Hanta shook his head and unwrapped his arm from around Izuku's shoulders. Izuku, my man. Izuku peeked at him through his fingers, failing to hide his red cheeks. Here's the thing, Mina. Here he stood beside the pink-haired girl and flicked her in the leg. She has never had a boyfriend, so her advice is invalid. She kicked him softly in the side of the head. Hey, you haven't had a girlfriend or a boyfriend either. He wiggled his finger at her and then turned back to Izuku. That's true. But that's because I've never followed my own advice. I'm a coward, he said so smugly, a hand on his puffed out chest. My advice for you, our dear pining friend, is just be honest with the guy. Tell Shouto you like him, and best case scenario is you guys get together, and worst case is he says he's not interested and you guys just stay as bros. Simple as that. Slowly Izuku lowered his hands from his face. Mina hopped off of the table and the three stood close together again. She sighed, crossing her arms. That's actually pretty good advice too. So either way, Izuku, I think you're good. Plus, what's not to like about you? He giggled, nervously tugging at the collar of his gray polo. I don't know, I'll think about it. But thanks you guys, it's nice to have someone to talk to about this. Mina squeezed him tightly cheek to cheek as their pink and green curls mixed brightly. We are here for you, Izuku. And if things don't work out, let's have a sleepover and cry over ice cream. It had been a peaceful few hours of work. There had been a concert the night before, and so there was lots of cleaning for the janitors to do. But busy work meant quiet work, and Izuku enjoyed being focused on his tasks. Even the notoriously rowdy trio was a little more quiet that day as they too scrubbed at the floors, picked up trash, and deep cleaned the bathrooms. There was less than half an hour left of his shift, and then hurry home to the shrine, back to the shrine spirits and Shouto. Izuku bit his lip as he thought of the fox yokai. Lately Shouto and him had grown closer, which overjoyed him. He considered the yokai to be his best and closest friend, and he was pretty sure the feeling was mutual. What he was unsure of was whether or not the more romantic feelings that he had for the red and white-haired man were reciprocated, or not. Was it possible Shouto felt the same way back? He dropped the rag he was holding and rubbed his face hard, a groan escaping his throat. There was no way Shouto liked him back. The fox was very clear on how he felt about yokai and human relationships, so it was obvious he wasn't interested in Izuku like that. If anything, he was only acting the way he did because he was Izuku's familiar. It was probably just a godfamiliar thing. Still, the way he'd smile softly when Izuku laughed, or the teasing words he used and attractive smirks he had when they'd playfully banter, it was hard to ignore those actions and not feel a little special. Izuku picked the rag back up and stood up from his low squat on the floor, quickly going to put away his supplies. Just as he closed the tin closet tightly, flinching at the loud bang like he always did every time he put his things away, he heard a feminine shriek from the hallway. He rushed out of the supply closet, fists ready to attack, only to be pushed to the side and into the wall by a head of bright pink hair. Mina, he called out in confusion. As he straightened up, she was sprinting after Denki, who was farther down the hall, Hanta coming up right behind her. Both Denki and Mina vanished around the corner. But Izuku grabbed the black-haired boy's arm before he could pass him and yanked him back. What's going on? Why are you guys running? Dude, Hanta gasped out, hands on his knees, as he caught his breath. This super creepy bright purple snake got into the stadium. Denki managed to catch it, and he put it on Mina's shoulders. And she got pissed. He started to laugh before continuing, it's so cool. Though man, you gotta see it, the thing is super long too. Denki took it with him. A snake? Izuku questioned, eyebrow raised doubtfully. But he followed Hanta along nonetheless. Had seen crazier things at this point than a simple snake. They hurried around the corner, but the other two had gone down, following the sound of Mina's angry yelling and Denki's hysterical laughter. Denki Kaminari, as soon as I get my hands on you, I'm killing you. And that snake do it. The blonde teased, swinging the thin snake towards her face. She smacked it away with a scream, causing it to fly out of Denki's hand and hit the floor hard with a soft slapping sound. Denki shouted out a surprised hey as Izuku and Hanta both winced, rushing over to the two guys. Stop, you're going to end up killing the poor thing, Izuku cried, kneeling down to gently pick up the writhing snake. It was small and thin, instantly wrapping itself tightly around Izuku's wrist. The snake was a muted lavender color, with a light gray belly and dark violet eyes. Izuku stroked it softly, admiring its pretty color and smooth texture. Mina kicked Denki in the leg, causing him to help out in pain before she looked over to Izuku, who was trying to comfort the snake. Sorry, Izuku. I didn't mean to hurt it. Denki just freaked me out. If anything, I should have thrown him to the ground. Denki raised his hands defensively before covering behind Hanta. Sorry, Mina, I didn't think Iaru'd get mad like this. Is the thing okay? Hanta asked Izuku, voice full of concern. Izuku raised the snake closer to his face and nodded. I think so, it doesn't seem hurt. But I don't know much about snakes, to be honest. Denki moved away from Hanta to look at the snake. It turned its little head to send him a sharp glare, one that made all of them shiver. That's weird, Denki cringed, taking a step back. You should take that thing back outside, Izuku. I will, Izuku agreed, narrowing his eyes suspiciously at the snake before saying goodbye to the others and hurrying for the exit. I've never seen or heard of a snake being so Expressive, he said to himself watching, as the snake slithered lower into his palm, and through his fingers. You're an odd thing. But pretty too. At that comment, the snake paused its moment, and looked up at Izuku, dark eyes watching him curiously as he walked out the doors, and into the cool evening air. Izuku hurried over to a patch of grass off to the side of the parking lot, and bent down, letting the snake slide off his hand. He watched it crawl away and smiled to himself, content that the snake was free and ultimately unharmed. The freckled boy shivered slightly from the cold outside temperature, and rushed back inside to grab his jacket and clock out. He was excited to get back to the shrine. He put on his blue jacket, and pushed the sleeves up to his elbows out of habit, all the while never noticing the red scar-looking stripes around his forearm, and the shimmery white bracelet-like mark around his wrist. When did you get this? Shouto demanded soon after Izuku arrived home. He grabbed Izuku's wrist tightly, turning it, and examining the iridescent mark that wrapped around Izuku's wrist. A deep scowl on his face. Izuku sputtered, just noticing the mark. I don't know. I didn't even realize it was there. Do you know what this is? Izuku shook his head, and Shouto let go of his hand, running his own hand through his hair in frustration. What happened today? He growled. Nothing much, except right before I got off, Denki and the others caught this little snake. I let it out for them, or for it. I guess poor thing was probably terrified from them. Shaking it around, he hunched his shoulders, awkwardly confused to why his familiar was so upset. Damn it, Izuku, Shouto huffed. That snake marked you. It's claimed you as its lifelong partner, and it definitely will be showing up soon to marry you. Marry me, the land god shrieked, his face turning crimson. I don't want to get married yet, and to a snake. The fox yokai crossed his arms, his pointy ears twitching impatiently. Then maybe you shouldn't have been so, I don't know, friendly with it. I was trying to help it, Izuku wailed. Tsuyu poked her head into the living room, where the two happened to be voice flat, as she simply stated, Master Shouto. It's not Izuku's fault, he's so charming, he just has that effect on everyone. You of all people should know that. Tsuyu-chan, Shouto glared, voice ice cold, as Izuku spun around to her, his own voice high-pitched. As he asked, what's that supposed to mean? Ochako skipped into the room, hair bouncing with every step. She just means we all know how adorable and kind you are, Izuku. Oh, how exciting. You're going to be married? No, not, he yelled as Shouto simultaneously spat. No, he's not, she giggled behind her hands. I know. Just teasing, don't worry, Izuku. Master Shouto will protect you from the spooky serpent. She wriggled her little fingers, moving towards Tsuyu to tickle her. They giggled sweetly with one another, Tsuyu half-heartedly pushing Ochako away. I'll just have to go to work with you again, the yokai sighed, as if it was such a burden for him. I don't want another incident where you're cornered by another yokai who wants you for one reason or another. Sorry, Izuku cringed, feeling already bad for mistakenly getting himself into this unfortunate and odd situation. Shouto shook his head, his face softening a little. Don't be, you're simply too kind for your own good. Plus, it's my duty and honor to protect you as your familiar. And also friend. Izuku's cheeks crinkled happily, his freckles brought out more by the pink, dusting his face. The shrine spirits and Shouto all felt their hearts burst just a little at the sweet sight. Izuku's own chest feeling full at Shouto referring to him as a friend. He brought up a hand to the yokai's sleeved arm, squeezing it firmly but gently. Thank you, Shouto. Later that evening, Izuku insisted that the four of them watch a movie. I don't work till 3 tomorrow, so well, I'll have time to sleep in and still get some chores done around the shrine. He grinned. He was impossible to resist, so the three agreed, and soon were all squished around the coffee table in front of the sofa, the lights off, and the room illuminated by the soft glow of the TV screen. Izuku had a few movies he was in the mood for, but wanted to let the others pick. Of course, television was still a slightly strange concept to the yokai and shrine spirits, and so they didn't have much experience yet with movies. Shouto said he didn't care what they watched, and so Tsuyu and Ochako looked over Izuku's choices together. Spirited Away is really good, Izuku explained as the girls looked over the movie cover. Tsuyu, having pointed out that the girl illustrated was cute, it used to scare me as a kid, but now it just makes me really happy. And what about this one, Kiro? Tsuyu picked up another DVD and showed it to Izuku and Ochako. Ponyo, he smiles so wide his eyes closed. Basically, The Little Mermaid, but cuter. The Little Mermaid? Shouto questioned from behind them. Now already seated on the sofa, Izuku laughed. Basically, Fish Girl wants to be human. But anyways, that one's really cute too. Ochako picked up the last DVD, biting her lip, as if holding back a smile, and tried to look more serious. And what's this one, Izuku? He smiled sheepishly, rubbing the back of his neck in slight embarrassment. That one is another one of my favorites. Not normally very interested in romance movies, but that one was my mom's favorite, and so I grew up watching it a lot. Let's watch that one then, Tsuyu croaked, and Ochako bobbed her head in agreement. Okay. He got up and popped the movie into the DVD player. Then he sat himself beside Shouto on the couch, shoulders lightly touching. The shrine spirited jumped onto the couch beside him, forcefully shoving him hard into the fox yokai, so they could fit comfortably. It wasn't a very large couch, and so they all ended up a little squished. Izuku tried to keep his face away from Shouto, hoping he wouldn't notice the blush on his face. It wasn't long before the tension in Izuku's shoulders went away, And he leaned into the warmth of Shouto's left side. Shouto's heart fluttered as he felt the boy settle in beside him, resting his green head on his shoulder, and breathe evenly. It felt nice to have someone so comfortable around him, and vice versa. He wasn't sure when he'd ever felt so relaxed with another person before. The thought concerned him slightly. He really ought to be more professional with Izuku. But it was hard to not indulge in the boy's affection, his light, and his happiness. And so there really was no harm in allowing their friendship to exist and grow stronger. It was just friendship, nothing more. That's what he tried to tell himself. At least not even halfway through, the land god was snoring quietly, his body fallen over and laid out across Shouto's lap. His mouth was opened unattractively, but the pretty length of his eyelashes and his endearingly soft expression made up for it. Shouto lifted up a cold hand to Izuku's face, lightly tapping along the young man's cheeks. As he counted the freckles that spread about like stars in the night sky, he traced them like little constellations, slowly letting his hand grow heavier until he was practically stroking the smoothness of Izuku's round cheeks. But strong jaw, isn't he pretty while he sleeps? Ochako hummed, looking up at Shouto with her large doll-like eyes from beside Izuku. Tsuyu glanced over, a knowing smile on her face. He's snoring and drooling, Shouto said almost defensively. He looks ridiculous. And yet still so cute, right, Master Shouto? She winked. It's okay, no shame in admitting it. The frog-like girl let out a small chuckle. Ochako-chan doesn't know what shame is. I've caught her peeping on Izuku many times while he sleeps, Kuro. He's just so adorable. She threw her hands up. I like to look at cute things. Sumitsu-chan. Shouto looked back down to Izuku. His bangs were fallen back, revealing his forehead. More, he moved his hand away from the sleeping boy's face, allowing it to rest on Izuku's chest. It was sturdier than he expected, and he had to resist feeling around more. Just the thought made his face warm, and he snapped his head back up to the sappy movie playing in front of them. It would be wrong to grope his sleeping friend, just because he was mildly curious of his surprisingly toned body. When the movie ended, Izuku was still laid in Shouto's lap. Except now his face was curled into the yokai's stomach. Ochako was snuggled up against Izuku's hip, her arms wrapped around Tsuyu, who laid over her chest. While the two also slept peacefully, the yokai didn't have the heart to waken any of them, so he settled into the couch and allowed his eyes to close, one hand on Izuku's side and the other tangled in his green unruly hair. Aizawa looked displeased to see Shouto coming to work with Izuku. Then again, he sort of always looked that way, like everything in his life was an inconvenience to him in some way or other. He was coming down the hall, having just left his office, as the two boys entered through the back doors of the stadium. The exhausted man let out a loud groan, and then beckoned for the two to come closer to him. Izuku. He looked to the shorter man, eyes dark with exhaustion and glad. You think this is some fun hangout place for you to bring friends? But if your pal here is going to keep showing up, I'm going to start putting him to work. Shouto just blinked lazily, looking down to see what Izuku had to say. Ooh, he thought for a moment, nervously twiddling with his fingers, then looked back at Shouto. Do you want to work here with me? It was impossible not to notice the little bit of desire in his voice, so the yokai sighed and turned back to Aizawa. Sure, I'll work part-time, if y'all have me all right. Then he turned back towards his office, had the boys wait outside in the cold hall, and then soon came out with another ugly polo for Shouto to wear. The man tossed it to Shouto, who caught it easily with one hand, and then waved them off as he went off to wherever he intended on going before. Izuku looked to Shouto and watched with mild interest as the red and white-haired man pulled the gray shirt over his head, wearing it over the simple white tee he was wearing before, and then buttoned the polo buttons tight on his neck. Stupid, Izuku groaned with darkened cheeks. What is? Shouto asked curiously, his hands dropping from his neck. Izuku rubbed his eyes hard with his palms, turning to head towards the elevators. Even in these stupid polos, you still look good, he grumbled. Oh, the yokai replied, having the audacity to look genuinely shocked. Thank you. Izuku sent him a glare, slightly mumbling as he spoke. Don't act so surprised, I'm sure. You know very well how attractive you are. Shouto frowned, crossing his arms over his chest as they stepped into elevator. He leaned back against a wall. I would disagree. But again, thank you. He sounded doubtful, like he didn't really believe what Izuku was saying, so the freckled boy pressed a button to go up. And then continued, I mean it, do you seriously not know the effect you have on people? I'm physically in good shape, which I know is an attractive quality, and Kami is always saying flirtatious things to me, Shouto said, looking to the ceiling in thought. But she doesn't actually mean it, she's just being Kami. His hand came up slowly, his fingers just lightly brushing the scarring around his left eye. I think she's just trying to make me feel better, even with a strong body. How could anyone be attracted to someone with a scar like this? Within a second, Izuku had cleared the distance between them, moving Shouto's hand down to get a clear view of his face. He went up on his tiptoes, body warm, as he leaned against Shouto's faces, just inches away from each other. Shouto stared in shock, mouth slightly open, as Izuku's face was fierce with determination. His warm, freckled hands came up to cup Shouto's face firmly. Shouto. He shouted, voice loud in the quiet elevator. Shouto, you're beautiful. The fox yokai could only gape, his mouth dropping completely open, eyes widening, and his face turning a rosy shade of pink. His red and white fox ears popped out the top of his head, little wisps of smoke floating to the ceiling. The left side of Shouto's face started to literally burn, causing Izuku to yelp out and jump back. His own right hand, red like head, touched a hot stove. I'm sorry, Shouto whined, his hands now covering his steaming face in embarrassment that wasn't typical for the fox. Cute Izuku clutched at his chest, own ears pink, as he remembered his conversation had with Mina and Hanta the day before. Mina had advised flirting and Hanta suggested honesty. Maybe he could do a little of both. I mean it, he stuttered, now embarrassed by his previous boldness, but still determined to flatter the man. Scar, and all you really are something, Shouto. First he opened his brown eye, then the turquoise one, both peeking at Izuku from beneath shy fingers. Izuku smiled gently and approached Shouto again. He grabbed the yokai's hands, lowering them away from his face. Shouto was still blushing, something Izuku could definitely stare at for forever. If allowed, his Adam's apple bobbed as he gulped, his cold and warm hands trembling slightly in Izuku's hold. Shouto, I have to tell you something. Izuku dropped his gaze down to his red sneakers. Shouto's deep voice was just barely above a whisper. What is it, Izuku? I think he took a long shaky breath. I think in. The elevator doors opened up with it, revealing the rambunctious trio. They took in the sight of Izuku and Shouto standing unnecessarily close for being the only two in the elevator. Everyone's gaze turned to Izuku holding Shouto's hands, which were immediately dropped as Izuku jumped backwards, his entire face and ears turning an embarrassing shade of pink. Shouto coughed uncomfortably, his fox ears quickly vanishing as he brought a hand up to his mouth, hiding his face behind his closed fist. As he turned away from the others, Denki and Hanta wore mischievous grins as Mina squealed loudly, oh my god, we interrupted something, didn't we? Oh my god, we can go. I'm so sorry, you guys. She turned around, grabbing the blonde and black-haired boys by the collar of their shirts and taking them with her before Izuku spoke up. Mina, no, you guys are fine. He awkwardly laughed, his face slowly turning back to its original colors, freckles a noticeable contrast against the calming blush. Denki pulled away from the pink-haired girl and turned back towards the elevator. If you're sure, man. Hey, Shouto, is that a uniform? Mina spun around, smile wide as she screeched, oh my god, a uniform? Is Shouto working with us now too? Only part-time, and maybe temporarily, Shouto said firmly back, now against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest again. He was still avoiding eye contact with everyone. Izuku especially. That's great, man. Hanta pumped his fist, standing beside Shouto. As the other two quickly got in the elevator, Mina pressed a button for the top floor. As Hanta continued, Izuku is always saying how much he misses you while he's working, so it's great that you guys can work together now too. He sent a quick wink to Izuku, who was red-faced yet again. Hanta, he hissed. Shouto's eyes looked up to Izuku, his face somewhat in thought, as he then said to Hanta, looking forward to working with him too. Our home feels emptier when he's gone. Awa, Mina whispered from beside Izuku, clutching his arm. Izuku smiled, softly touched by Shouto's words. You guys are close then, huh? Denki smirked, and Izuku sent him a glare as well. What was up with the betrayal? The fox yokai nodded, exiting the elevator first, as the others followed behind him closely to hear his response. Yes, Izuku is my best friend, and I wish to make his life easier and more fulfilled. Mina groaned, rolling her eyes up to the ceiling, and Denki and Hanta deflated. They gave Izuku sorry expressions, and he waved them off. Friend zone is rough, man, but don't give up, Denki whispered into his ear. Izuku shoved him away, afraid of Shouto. Hearing them, Hanta pulled the mischievous blonde away, sending Izuku another apologetic look. Well, anyways, have a good first day of work, Shouto. Well, see you guys around. Mina nodded her head in agreement, and the three hurried off to their scheduled cleaning assignments. Izuku nervously looked over to Shouto, who was watching him curiously, his lips in a relaxed line and expression. Patient, follow me. It's an easier schedule today, Izuku sighed, rubbing nervously at the white mark on his wrist as his stomach fluttered with nerves. He hoped Shouto wouldn't bring up their conversation from earlier. Thankfully, he didn't. Shouto, you're beautiful. Izuku's words and his determined and caring voice played on a repeat in Shouto's head. He consciously regulated his temperature, keeping himself cool to fight back the warm blush that kept attempting to make a home on his face. The yokai generally considered himself more masculine, and he would never think to describe himself as beautiful or pretty. But hearing Izuku call him such a thing made his heart throb and want more. It was incredibly frustrating and confusing. He never felt this way with Mama-sama. His desire to serve her was just as strong. He was a faithful and loyal familiar. After all, she complimented him, praised him for his good work. But he never felt like this. He couldn't understand what it was about the human god that was so addicting. Izuku was explaining their responsibilities for the day, going into much more detail than necessary as he rambled about the tasks they needed to complete. He was talking even more than usual, probably to diminish his obvious fluster and embarrassment from earlier. Shouto half listened, but the other half of his mind just kept repeating the elevator incident. He thought of how his own hands felt in Izuku's rough but gentle hold, the way the green-haired boy looked at him almost pleading as he kindly attempted to make Shouto feel better about himself. It was so strange. If the other humans hadn't shown up, Shouto wondered what he would have done. He wanted Izuku closer, that much he knew the yokai for a moment, glancing over to Izuku, who was waving his hands about as he explained how weird and loud the vacuums are. But they work so well, way better than the one Mom had imagined what it would be like to stop Izuku stop his endearing rambling by pressing his own lips against the others and tasting him, silencing him. He felt heat forming on his fingertips, and he quickly looked away, forming his hand into a fist to extinguish the small flame that had formed. Izuku noticed the uncomfortable look on his face and stopped to ask if he was all right. Shouto nodded, avoiding any eye contact as he made an excuse about feeling a little tired. Izuku frowned slightly and apologized for making Shouto come with him to work. "I want to be here," he reminded, feeling bad for guilting Izuku more. The land god smiled. "Well, I bet if we work hard and fast we can leave early and just relax. I'm really glad we were assigned the top floor. The only room actively used is Kaiuka's dressing room and her practice room, so we should be able to do it easily." Shouto's gaze dropped from Izuku's smiling face to the arm where the white mark of engagement shimmered. He scowled. Now wasn't the time to be distracted. Someone sooner or later would be coming for Izuku, and he needed to do everything in his power to keep the bright, happy land god safe. Izuku lied, not intentionally of course, but the work they had to do that day turned out to be one of the most intensive work days Izuku had ever had. At first things were easy. He and Shouto vacuumed the entire top floor, taking extra care to tidy up Kaiuka's dressing room nicely for her. Izuku smiled softly to himself as he watched Shouto arrange some flowers on her vanity for her, a kind but unnecessary touch. The vase was clear, filled with multicolored purple and red foxgloves. He had no idea where Shouto had gotten the flowers, but he had a feeling it had something to do with his yokai magic. It was sweet, thoughtful, and Izuku's cheeks warmed, excited for Kaiuka to find them later. They moved out of the room and were almost done dusting all the windows and furniture when Izuku's work radio buzzed loudly. He unclipped it from the back of his pants and held it up between him and Shouto so that he could listen as well. "New assignments for today." Aizawa sighed, irritation evident in his deep voice. "There's been a last-minute event scheduled for the stadium tomorrow, some big company party or something. Y'all all have tomorrow off, but now y'all need to work 10 times as hard to get everything needed done today. Congratulations." "Got it, sir. Thank you." That was Itsuka. And then the radio went silent, and Izuku groaned. So much for an easy day. He and Shouto had to ride the elevator back down to the employee break room, which was really just a supply closet with their schedules taped to the wall and a water cooler on the side. After checking their new, much more intensive schedule, the two set out to their much busier day of work. They were both assigned to deep cleaning and decorating seating sections of the main concert hall, as well as putting up props on the stage. It wasn't until almost an hour after their shift was scheduled to be over that they finally finished. The concert arena looked amazing. Each seat had a red ribbon tied to it, and the concert stage was decorated with ribbons, lace, and lots of bows. Despite it being such tedious work, everyone worked hard, and it showed. It was a very cutesy event, whatever it was, and Izuku thought of the shrine spirits back at home. "Ochikachan would like this," he said aloud, smiling softly as he admired the adorable decorations and pink lighting that Denki and Hanta had set up. "It's cute, right, Shouto?" he said louder, taking out his cell phone to snap a picture to show the girls later. When Shouto didn't reply, Izuku turned around to find the fox yokai fast asleep, sitting in one of the chairs with his head back against a bow, using it as a pillow. Izuku chuckled softly, lifting his arms up to quickly snap another picture, this time of the sleeping yokai. He looked soft, his mouth closed and lashes long against his cheeks. His head was slightly tilted, so some of his red hair strands mixed into the white, creating a pastel blend of pinks. Izuku's wrist glinted in the pink lighting, reflecting rosy shades. The mark was still as bright as the day before, something he noticed Shouto glaring at throughout the day. Slowly, he reached forward, lightly combined his fingers through Shouto's silky fine hair. It was softer than he expected, kind of reminding him of petting a long-haired cat. He wished the fox ears were there. "Curious to how they'd feel while he's really out," Denki whispered, walking up to Izuku with his arms full of electrical equipment. He looked strained, but smiled brightly nonetheless. "Do you think you could help me take these leftovers back to the supply closet on the second floor? They're a little heavy." Of course. Izuku moved away from Shouto to take half of Denki's load. "Thanks, man," the blonde breathed out in immediate relief, and the two set off. Izuku spared a glance at Shouto, but decided to let the fox nap for just a little longer while he could before they had to walk home. "So how have things been going with Kaiuka?" Izuku asked, giving Denki a kind but slightly mischievous smile. As they walked side by side towards the elevators, the blonde boy beamed awkwardly, twisting his wrist, while his arms were full of heavy wiring, to shoot Izuku a thumbs up. "Awesome. Actually, we've hung out a bunch, always with the others too. But I think soon I'm going to ask her out on a solo date. Gotta get out of the friend zone. You know how it is." Izuku pouted softly, cheeks warming. "SHH. But that's great, Denki. I hope it goes well, thanks. If everything works out, I'm a little nervous. I mean, I'd be dating a celebrity. Think of the angry fans. I'd be jealous of me, dude." That made Izuku bark out a laugh. They soon made it to the closet, and quickly put away the equipment neatly. Denki waved his goodbyes, told Izuku to enjoy his day off with a wink and suggestive tone, and they parted ways. Izuku hurried back to the elevator, eager to grab Shouto and get home. He tapped his foot patiently as the elevator slowly made its ascent. His head felt a little heavy due to the tiredness of a long day of work. The elevator doors opened silently, and as he exited, he immediately noticed how dark it was outside. It was bright inside the building, so much so that he could see his reflection in the window. Instead of the outside moonlit skies, his green eyes glanced over at a clock, seeing that it was now 10:40. They should have been leaving at 9:30. With a lick of his lips, he wondered if Tsuyu or Ochako had any dinner waiting for them at home. Interrupting his thoughts, an unfamiliar but modulated voice spoke out from behind him. "It's getting late, isn't it, Izuku?" Izuku could see in the window's reflection that a man was behind him, so he cautiously turned his head, gritting his teeth anxiously as he asked faintly, "How do you know my name?" The first thing Izuku noticed about the man was that he looked tired. His dark violet eyes were sitting on some of the darkest under-eye bags had ever seen, and that was saying something considering he knew Aizawa. But yet, despite looking like he hadn't slept in 10 years, Izuku felt his breath catch slightly with nerves, like he always did when meeting an attractive person. His hair was lavender up and away from his face in a way that reminded Izuku of a lion's mane. He glanced down at the gray polo he was wearing and silently cursed Aizawa for giving him the ugliest uniform on the planet. The boring uniform he wore really dulled in comparison to the sleek black yukata that the other man was dressed in. "Of course I know your name," the man smirked, stepping closer to Izuku. He was slightly taller than Shouto, so Izuku had to lift his head slightly, as he did with the fox yokai, in order to keep eye contact, as the man literally pushed him against the window. "You're very important to me." After all, despite the way his body trembled, Izuku tried to remain calm and controlled. He tried to firmly push the man away, ignoring the hard muscular chest he could feel beneath his palm. As he shoved the man away from him, stumbling back, his mouth opened in shock before he rebalanced himself and grinned widely, running a hand through his long wild hair. "You're stronger than I thought, Yaobi," he said more to himself than Izuku before approaching him yet again. "Calm down, my little mouse. I'm not going to eat you." At the mention of mouse, Izuku's eyes widened in realization. "You're the snake from earlier." The man nodded. "I'm glad you recognized me as soon as you showed me your kindness. I knew you'd be the perfect partner to spend the rest of my life with." Izuku grimaced at that and lifted his arm, his wrist mark flashing in the light. As he glared at the man, "I never agreed to this," he motioned to the mark. "I don't even know your name, Izuku-sama," he said, pushing Izuku's arm down to reach out and grip his face by the chin, his fingers cold and not gentle, his deep voice almost hissing with the way he spoke. "My name is Hitoshi Shinsu. Will you marry me?" Blood rushed to Izuku's cheeks as he looked away in frustrated embarrassment. "And no, I will not marry you." The man pouted, eyebrows furrowed, as he replied, "That's a shame." "Oh well," he added, ignoring Izuku's struggling attempts to get out of the man's hold as he brought Izuku's body to his chest in a tight embrace. "Any answer will do now. Close your eyes and come with me." Before he could even refuse, Izuku felt his eyes close and body go numb. It reminded him of the time Kyoka's blood curse froze all his movements, except this time he was moving just without any control over himself. It was like a dream, the way he moved and could hear things, but couldn't stop himself, couldn't make his own decisions. He felt the snake yokai take his hand and lead him somewhere, completely clueless to where he was going or what he should do. Izuku wanted to object, wanted to get away and just find Shouto, but his body moved on its own. His thoughts were screaming, begging him to fight back. But his lips stayed tightly shut. The last thing he remembered was Hitoshi's honeyed voice, softly whispering in his ear, "Now fall asleep, my dear Izuku, we'll be home soon." Shouto awoke with a start, a rough hand shaking him by the shoulder. He looked up, groaning, as he glared at Izuku's boss Aizawa, whose dark, exhausted eyes glared right back. "What the hell are you still doing here, kid?" His tone was surprisingly soft, almost compassionate, as he removed his hand from Shouto's shoulder. "You're the only one here." That woke Shouto up, his heart suddenly racing as he jumped to his feet and looked around in a sudden panic. "Where's Izuku?" "Not here, probably went home already." Shouto gave him a chilling look, his disagreement evident in his harsh stare. So Aizawa shrugged. "I'm going to lock up. You have 5 minutes to leave before I lock you in. Have a good night." With that, he turned and left, leaving Shouto in his internal panic. He stood in complete silence for a minute, his eyes shut tight and jaw tense, his breath short and fast as frost began to form on his left side, his hands balled into fists, his whole body rigid as he began to shake. "No, no, no, no." The yokai swung his arm back and punched at the air in anger, his right arm coated in ice as his left arm rose up in flames. "God damn it," he shouted, voice cracking with anguish as he slumped down onto his knees, half of the work uniform burning off of his shoulder and back. "I can't lose you." Izuku had no idea where he was. His head was aching, a strange dull pain that made him feel like he'd been smacked in the head without the actual physical pain of being hit. Had gone in and out of consciousness several times, had lost count before he finally fully came to. Sitting up, he massaged his temples as he examined the room he was in. It was some sort of living room type area of a shrine very similar to his own, except all the walls and furniture were tinted a shade of aqua, Something about the place felt eerie different, reminding him of the spirit world atmosphere. Where Shouto's training dojo was currently, he was alone. But he wasn't sure for how much longer. Standing took some effort, his balance off, and his head ringing as he tried to get some control over himself. With a deep breath, he headed for the nearest door, sliding it open, and peering outside. It looked late, the moon high in the sky illuminating the forest that seemed to surround the humble shrine. All he could see were trees and bushes and one single path that went through a tall gate and off into the woods. "That's gotta be my way out," he huffed, stepping out onto the balcony, and then down, his footsteps careful and soft in the dewy grass. Now that he thought about it, everything felt kind of dewy. The air was definitely humid, the moisture making him feel clammy and uncomfortably warm. He quickened his pace, nervous for the snake yokai to discover him leaving. With one last glance back to the shrine, as he passed the gate, he saw that there was a tall cherry blossom tree that stood guarding the shrine just on the other side. It looked beautiful in the moonlight, its pink petals a beautiful contrast to the green surroundings. Izuku shook his head. He needed to focus and get out of there. With one last deep breath, he ran down the path. He wanted to feel happy or excited that he was away from this Hitoshi Shinsu. But a heavy feeling of dread refused to leave his stomach. Something about the forest felt wrong, unsafe. As he jogged, he tried to be positive and felt slightly grateful that he and Shouto exercised regularly, as he was in much better shape than he was a couple of months ago. Shouto, he whispered to himself. He missed the fox yokai, terribly missed Shouto's stale sense of humor and his consideration, but also aloof attitude about everything, and especially missed his comforting presence with Shouto. He always felt a little more braver, a little more confident with himself, safer, right then, completely alone and running down a dark path to who knows where. Izuku did not feel safe. Back at the land god's shrine, Shouto sat on the back porch with his head in his hands. Tsuyu and Ochako watched him from a distance, holding on to each other as a source of comfort for one another. The frog-like shrine spirit combed her large fingers through Ochako's soft brown hair, feeling her sniffle against her chest. "Master Shouto, we'll find him," Tsuyu croaked. "I can see he's struggling, but he's strong." Ochako shook her head. "But he won't use it, Tsuchin. You know he refuses to use his fire powers," because her voice lowered to a barely audible whisper of endeavor. "How foolish," Tsuyu stated bluntly. "If he just used his fox fire, he could find Izuku quickly. I'm sure I've heard many tales of the hunting abilities that a fire kitsune has. They can hunt down anyone, so I've heard it's true. But Master Shouto never uses it. I mean, I don't think he ever even used it to try and find Mama-sama." Ochako sighed. "It seems we've already lost another land god. The shrine will be in ruins." But her eyes watered again. "Is it wrong that I'm more concerned for Izuku-sama than I am for the shrine's well-being?" Tsuyu gave her a look, but faltered. "I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel the same way. That boy really is special. And I think Master Shouto knows it too. Look, Ochako-chan." She looked up, her warm brown eyes widening as she gaped. Tsuyu, he's using his fire." It was only a small flame in Shouto's opinion. It was about a foot tall, a deep red flickering wildly in his palm, lighting up his face. Still, it was the most fire head intentionally brought up in a long time, and he felt himself trembling. "I've got to do this for Izuku," he whimpered, his eyes watering from the stress and the intensity of the heat against his face. The flame turned into a dark teal color as he twisted it in his palm, focusing his thoughts on the green-haired freckled boy that he desperately missed. He stood up from the porch, holding the flame in front of him with a heavy breath. He launched the flame into the air. "Find him," he called out, watching as the ball of fire soared into the night sky. Shouto turned to the girl's eyes lit up and his face earnest as he yelled to them, "I'll be back soon with Izuku. I promise." Ochako clutched her chest, watching Shouto run after the flame. "Tsuyu, did you see his face?" "I did, Kiro," she replied, tapping her chin in thought. "I think Master Shouto is in love." "I think so too," Ochako sighed blissfully. "Let's just hope he's not stupid enough to try and ignore it." With aching legs, Izuku dragged his feet, urging himself to keep going. It felt like he'd been running for hours, and he was exhausted. Sweat dripped down his face and neck for being this late at night. It was incredibly hot. He scratched at his itchy neck, dreaming of a cold, refreshing bath, and his cool, silky blankets. Back at the shrine, Shouto's face appeared in his head, and he sighed at the thought of the fox's cold hand touching his face. How refreshing it would feel. Just then he noticed a light up ahead. He grinned in relief, and with a new burst of energy, he sprinted towards the light. In the distance, he could see a silhouette of someone. They stood just below the lamp post. His lungs were begging him to slow down, but he was so close to freedom. He kept running until he got closer, and the figure suddenly became clear. "No how," he gasped out, tripping over his own feet. He stumbled hard, crashing into the floor and sliding painfully against the dirt pavement. His palms and knees stung. Tiny pieces of gravel cut into his skin. Izuku glared up at the snake yokai, who smiled innocently above him. "Welcome back, Izuku. I knew you'd show up sooner or later, but I still missed you," he groaned as he sat up, picking at the dirt embedded in the palm of his hands. "What the hell is this place? You're so grumpy," Hitoshi sighed before taking Izuku's hands and dabbing them with a cloth. "And clumsy. My goodness, anyways. This is your home now." The freckled boy pulled his hands away and held them defensively against himself. "No, it isn't. I'd like to go back to my real home. Now Shouto is waiting for me. Hitoshi rolled his dark eyes at that. I doubt it. He's a lousy familiar from what I've heard, always losing track of his gods. Listen Izuku, a familiar for Lady 𝗕𝗓𝗏. She's told me many times that the world's best familiar. He puffed his chest out proudly and led Izuku up the steps back towards the shrine. Izuku was too tired to fight back, plus he didn't have any other options in that moment. And so he followed, albeit cautiously. What did you do to me earlier? He demanded as they entered the shrine. The snake yokai gave him a curious look, pointing into an open room. This here is where your room is, he stated, and then went on with what sounded like fake confusion. Shouto didn't warn you about snakes. What else is that yokai hiding from you? I wonder. Izuku's frown only deepened. What are you talking about? Snakes are hunters too. You know we have ways of trapping our prey. It's simple really. I ask a question, you answer, and I have control over you. It's a form of brainwashing. I'll admit my use of it is somewhat limited. I can only control someone about once a day. But snakes don't need to eat that often anyways. He winked at Izuku, playfully causing him to blush despite the scowl on his face. What do you want from me? I want you to be my lifelong partner, of course. Hitoshi gave Izuku an incredulous look. I know you said no before, but I've got plenty of time to change your mind. Izuku could only stare at Hitoshi in offended shock. Had never met anyone so sure of himself, so disregarding. And it was infuriating. He stood up. I refuse to marry you. Hold me here all you want, but I promise you, Hitoshi, that I'll never have any feelings for you. To Izuku's surprise, the snake yokai gave him a large toothy grin. Well, be married platonically, then best friends. What? No, you don't want to be friends either, Hitoshi pouted, turning his body to glare out the open door and look out over the back patio. From there they had a clear view of the beautiful cherry blossom in the back. Something about his eyes, despite the over-the-top frown, looked genuinely sad. Izuku softened a bit, moving to sit beside Hitoshi and look out at the tree with him. Hitoshi had mentioned that he was a familiar, but as he sat in the silent shrine devoid of any shrine spirits like Ochako and Tsuyu, Izuku realized something. Hitoshi, he said gently, where is your god? The yokai stiffened face, going blank before giving Izuku a large fake smile. She's here in the shrine, of course. She's just resting in her room. Izuku stood up. I'd like to meet her. No, Hitoshi called out, scrambling to get up and stop Izuku. But it was too late. Had already made his way down the hall and opened up the one other bedroom, revealing an empty room with slow burning incense sitting in the center. Something in Izuku's chest hurt in the way Hitoshi's aura seemed to crumble before him. The yokai bowed his head, wild purple hair hanging low in defeat. Sit with me, Izuku, he invited, moving back to the porch. Izuku nodded, sitting beside Hitoshi with a comfortable distance between them. His eyebrows lowered in concern, his lips in a slight frown, and round green eyes focused intently on Hitoshi. Tell me what's going on, please. Hitoshi glanced over at Izuku, the sad smile on his face just not reaching his tired eyes. I may have lied just a little. He motioned to the cherry blossom tree, its beautiful branches hanging protectively over them, almost caressing the roof of the shrine, as if it were a loved one. This tree here is my Lady 𝗕𝗓𝗏. Izuku gave him a confused smile. I don't understand. She's passed on, the purple-haired man replied with a sigh, looking at the tree longingly. So technically this shrine is now without a god, and as a familiar I too am without a god. He didn't sound finished, so Izuku just nodded his head and continued to listen. Hitoshi went on. She was such an amazing god. The people loved her and her shrine, and she equally blessed them as much as they blessed her. Their farms and crops flourished. They were abundant with children and families, and overall everyone was just so happy. He stood up, leaving Izuku on the porch to walk over to the base of the cherry blossom tree. He put his hand gently on the trunk, stroking it before resting his forehead against it. And then the people became greedy. They wanted more than Lady 𝗕𝗓𝗏 had to give. She tried her best, but it wasn't enough. So the people moved on. They built buildings over her land, and the village turned into a bustling city, and the stupid people just forgot about her. How could they do that to her? His voice cracked with anguish as he looked back over his shoulder at Izuku. I'm so sorry, Izuku said sincerely, looking down at his lap. He felt Hitoshi sit beside him again. She grew weaker, tired of trying to please people who didn't care about her. I even proposed to her that we just leave. We could have run away together. But she didn't want that, didn't want me said. She was plenty old, wanted to become one with nature. So she planted herself into that tree and left me alone to watch over her and the shrine. But I couldn't just let her disappear like that, you know. So I've taken her and the entire shrine underwater. We're kind of in a protected spiritual bubble of sorts here. She's preserved, that's why I couldn't leave then, Izuku muttered, eyebrows furrowed. Hitoshi nodded. Yup, Lady 𝗕𝗓𝗏 requested only one thing from me before she left. She wanted me to find a partner to spend the rest of my life with. And so that's why I have you now, Izuku. He turned his head to the green-haired boy and gave him a soft smile. But it looks like you don't want to be with me either. Izuku sighed. Hitoshi, I'm sorry, but I really don't even know you. But we can be friends, and I mean honestly, I don't think your Lady 𝗕𝗓𝗏 meant marry the first person you find. Don't rush it, take your time meeting people, and find someone actually right for you. He ended it with a bright smile, one that made his eyes squint sweetly. But by doing that I'd have to be away from her a lot. Hitoshi grumbled, looking away from Izuku with a soft blush on his cheeks. I think she just wants you to be happy. Izuku put a comforting hand on Hitoshi's shoulder. If Shouto was by himself, I wouldn't want him to wait around all alone. I'd want him to go out and meet people. I'd want him to be happy and have friends. You deserve happiness too, Hitoshi. The yokai leaned into Izuku's touch. That stupid fox is really lucky that you're his familiar, he said with a smoother, quieter voice, glancing up at Izuku through his eyelashes. It's not fair that he gets you. Plus, when you keep saying nice things, it just makes me want you more. Izuku tensed, quickly removing his hand from Hitoshi, and blushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry. He was cut off by Hitoshi pushing him to the floor, letting out a small surprised gasp. As his back hit the wood, Izuku tried to push Hitoshi off of him. But the snake yokai struck him in the head with his fist, and then held his arms down, straddling his waist, and pinned him to the ground with no easy way of escape. His dark violet eyes were glazed with hunger, his tongue swiftly coming out to moisten his lips as he lowered his face closer to Izuku's with gritted teeth and a heavy pain in his head. Izuku turned his face as far as he could into his shoulder, faintly calling out Shouto. Save me. The fox yokai stood by the edge of a large pond, head somewhat tilted like a confused puppy. He crossed his arms over his chest, glaring at the water's surface, as his little flame of fire hovered just inches above it, as if it was waiting for him to dive in. Shouto huffed in frustration. He didn't have time for this. It was getting late, the moon's reflection shimmering beautifully in the pond's surface. But he just couldn't enjoy the striking sight right now. He knelt by the water, his mismatched eyes narrowing as he inspected it. The body of water seemed perfectly ordinary, but it made no sense for Izuku to be in a pond, unless he reached a hand out towards the water, lightly dipping a single fingertip. To his surprise, he felt nothing. It's a portal to some kind of spirit world, he muttered to himself. Shouto stood back up, took a few steps backwards, and then gracefully dived into the pond. As soon as his entire body passed through, he was pleased to find that he definitely didn't just dive fully clothed into a pond, but into the private barrier of a yokai. He floated down from the top of the pond, glancing up to see that the pond's surface now had the appearance of a night sky. It was clever and a well-made barrier. He couldn't help begrudgingly admiring. His feet landed lightly in soft dewy grass. Right away he felt considerably warmer, as the air in the barrier was far more moist and warm. Then back on land, the yokai sighed in irritation as his fox fire that led him there had vanished. Had hoped it would take him farther, but seeing as he only had a single path ahead of him, he admitted to himself that it wasn't really needed anyways. Part of Shouto was proud of himself. Had swore to never use his fire powers, as they were passed on to him from his god-awful father, who had used his own fire to only hurt everything around him. But using it for something like finding Izuku maybe wasn't so bad after all. Thinking of Izuku made his chest ache. The pride he felt instantly vanished, as he felt sick with guilt for somehow letting the young man slip out of his fingers. He was supposed to be watching over him, protecting him, and yet had failed yet again, lost another god. Some familiar he was. And yet this need to find Izuku was different from the way he felt when had been searching for Momo. When Momo left, it didn't feel like she was in danger. It just felt empty, almost like a loved one passing away. But with Izuku he felt this intense desire to get him back, he'd take on anything if he had to, and he didn't understand why. The fox quickened his pace, running a little faster down the dark forestry path. Izuku was close. He could sense it, feel it deep within himself. Just as a light came into view up ahead, he heard Izuku's voice, weak and quiet like a tiny whisper in the air. Shouto. Izuku had whimpered, almost inaudible, and yet the fearful voice hurt Shouto like it was screamed into his ears. Save me. His body moved on its own. Part of him felt his left side lose control for the second time that day, but he had no control over really anything right then. He was so blind with rage, so furious and quick that before he knew it, had burned off his entire shirt and stood in the center of some shrine head never been to before. Izuku was behind him. He knew that, could feel his warm trembling body against his heel. Across from them, pinned to the wall by a pillar of ice that lead back to Shouto's own ice-covered steaming body, is Hitoshi Shinsu. The snake yokai was unconscious, chin to his chest, as he hung limply. Shouto took a shuddering breath, and then swiftly dropped to the floor, turning his body so that he could reach for Izuku and pull him into his arms. Izuku molded himself into Shouto's chest, his face hiding in the crook of his neck, while his warm freckled arms wrapped tightly around Shouto's waist. His body ached, his left side feeling dry and burnt, while his right side was numbingly cold. Yet despite the pain of overusing his powers, he felt so much relief and comfort holding the land god against his bare skin, one arm clutching Izuku's back, while the other hand was tangled in messy green curls, holding Izuku like a lifeline. He was so warm and soft, and finally with him again. Shouto. Izuku's voice cracked out from Shouto's neck. Are you okay? He pulled Izuku away just enough to see his face, but still held him close, his eyebrows furrowed with bewilderment. Am I okay, Izuku? Are you okay? I am now, he sniffled, moving one of his hands from Shouto's back to wipe at his eyes. Shouto felt cold. Where Izuku's hand once was, the green-haired boy smiled up at Shouto softly, his freckles dusted in a pink blush that made Shouto feel warm, and confused before his emerald eyes moved away to look around the room. He giggled behind one hand, bumping his head against Shouto's chest, as he tried to stifle his tearful laughter. I was so scared. I don't even quite know why, but I was so scared. And then you showed up and Shouto, look what you've done. Shouto moved his gaze away from Izuku to examine the shrine, or what was left of it. Hitoshi, the snake yokai, was still frozen to one wall, but the wall behind Izuku had a huge hole in it, the edges seared and little planks of wood and rubble laid about, some of them still burning small flames, while others were singed black. Oh well, Shouto thought the snake deserved it. Izuku's laughter subsided, and he looked back up at Shouto, a small smile on his lips and eyes large and watery. He reached both hands up all the way to the top of Shouto's head, and dropped them gently on his red and white fox ears. They're so soft. He grinned lightly, rubbing them, which sent Shouto's whole body stiff, his arms tightening just a little around Izuku. He had to hold back a moan, his face burning, as he awkwardly coughed out, I think we should get going, Izuku, before he comes to. Izuku nodded, dropping his hands, and then moving his eyes down Shouto's face and down his chest all the way to his waist, where he was thankfully still clothed. Shouto suddenly felt very self-conscious about his half-naked state, as Izuku too seemed to realize that Shouto wasn't wearing a top the entire time. They'd held on to each other. His eyes widened, and he let out a shriek as he rolled away from Shouto and hid his face in the floor, Shouto reaching out for him naturally before bringing his arms back to his side. He gave Izuku a minute to relax, getting up and walking over to Hitoshi to add another layer of ice, just so he'd be stuck there a little longer. As the ice stopped forming from his fingertips, he felt a sharp pain in his upper arm that caused him to wince. Shouto grabbed at his arm as Izuku came rushing over, face still pink, but full of concern as he tenderly put his hands on Shouto's arm. You're freezing, he frowned. It happens when I overdo it like this, Shouto said. But it'll be fine, it usually feels better the next morning anyways. Izuku sighed with worry, but nodded his head and pulled Shouto along with him as they climbed through the hole in the wall and out towards the path. Do you know how to get out of here? Izuku asked, biting his bottom lip with nervousness. We're in a water barrier, Shouto explained, as he moved one arm around Izuku's shoulders and bent down to put another behind his knees, scooping him up quickly. But don't worry, it'll get us out of here. What? Izuku cried, holding on to Shouto tight, as the fox yokai jumped off the gravel floor and into the sky, almost flying effortlessly. He gasped into Shouto's neck, you can fly. The yokai smirked. No. But this is part of the spirit world, and yokai can move much more freely in places like this in simply jumping very high. It's a fox thing. They suddenly broke through the pond's surface, Shouto landing gracefully on the water's edge. He set Izuku down, choosing to keep one of his hands on the small of Izuku's back. Izuku looked out to the pond in amazement, in disbelief that Hitoshi had been hiding an entire shrine below the water. His eyes widened at the stunning sight of the moon, its white light glowing and shimmering in the water. It's amazing, huh? He breathed out, his eyes softened, long eyelashes casting a shadow over his cheeks, as he smiled sweetly at the sight. Izuku's face was boyish from the roundness of his cheeks, but his jaw was still nicely defined and handsome, the shimmer of light on his lips, the way his mouth was slightly smiling, and his cheeks dusted in freckles that begged to be kissed. Shouto couldn't take his eyes off of him. His own attention was on something or someone completely different than the pond, as he nodded his head, absolutely. The shrine walls shook, the sound of dishes and silverware rustled loudly from the kitchen as furniture in the living room bustled about. There was a bright flash of light from outside illuminating the dark rooms of the shrine and four varying expressions. And then, after a passing second, a booming roar of thunder caused another tremor throughout the shrine. Ochako squealed in fear, clutching Tsuyu tighter and burying her face deeper in the other girl's chest. The frog-like girl's large hand patted Ochako's head, her own face in a deep frown as each thunder strike continued again and again. Izuku couldn't remember the last time he experienced a thunderstorm this bad. He had fond memories of watching them from his room window as a curious child, though always from a safe far distance. But to be in the middle of one was an entirely different experience. The power in the shrine had gone out hours ago, so each passing set of minutes, sometimes seconds, was in complete darkness, until there was another flash of light and thunderous bangs that shook their safe little shrine. The lightning won't strike here, Shouto said, not for the first time that evening. He was the only one seemingly unfazed by the thunderstorm right outside their home, as he continued on with house chores in the dark, like it were any other evening. Another flash, another squeal from Ochako, and an anxious bite of his lip from Izuku. For a while Head sat with the girls. They seemed the most disturbed by the thunderstorm, but he had gotten restless, and now was just sort of following Shouto around, clutching at his shirt every time the lightning struck, and thunder made his bones feel like they were going to crumble. This doesn't bother you at all? He asked shyly, watching as Shouto continued to do the dishes in the dark. There were small candles in the room that gave just enough light for them to see what they were doing. Vaguely, the fox yokai shook his head, scarred, glancing over at Izuku before looking back to the soapy bowl in his hands. No, not really. My father was even louder than this when he was angry, so it doesn't faze me that much. Oh, was all Izuku could say before he jumped at the next roll of thunder, scooting himself a little closer to Shouto with a sigh. Shouto reached for a towel to dry his hands. Seems like the Idas are really upset tonight. Who? Izuku whispered, his body slightly shivering As he stood beside Shouto's warm side, a family of thunder and messenger gods, he explained, turning towards Izuku to wrap one arm around him and hold him closer. Izuku sighed in content, resting his head comfortably against Shouto's chest. As he continued, there hasn't been a storm this intense in years. I wonder if something tragic has happened. What do you mean? He asked, large green eyes looking up at Shouto in a way that made the yokai's chest flutter. Last time there was a storm this bad, the head of the Ida family had been caught cheating on his wife. Oh no, indeed, many humans and yokai fell victim to the not-so-natural disaster of that storm. Shouto kept his arm around Izuku's shoulders as they moved to the kitchen doorway, so I can't help but wonder what's happened to the family this time. I don't mind the youngest son, Tenya. He's a rabbit yokai, fastest damn messenger I've ever seen. Shouto walked them towards Izuku's bedroom, holding him a little closer as another flash of lightning and thunderous boom echoed through the shrine in his free hand. He carried a small candle-lit lantern, using it to guide them down the hall and into Izuku's room. He set the lantern down on the bedside table, then lifted back the blankets on Izuku's bed and gently pushed the nervous boy into the bed. With caring hands, he tucked the blankets around Izuku and then sat down beside him on top of the blankets. Are you okay? Shouto asked, looking down at Izuku with a small frown, noticing the boy still seemed tense. Izuku gave a half smile, grateful that it was too dark for Shouto to see his heated face. I'm okay, still just a little anxious about the... He was cut off by a strike of lightning, the crashing boom so immediate that it must have struck just outside of the shrine. Izuku yelped out, lifting the blankets to hide his face as he trembled. His eyes watered as he closed them tightly, wiggling himself closer to Shouto's body. I feel stupid being scared of the lightning like some kid, he whimpered from under the blanket. It's not stupid, Shouto said, as he pulled the blanket off of Izuku, crawled his way around him, and then slid into the sheets beside him, pulling the blankets back up around both of them snugly, while Izuku relaxed a little more, enjoying the heat that radiated off of Shouto's left side so much that it overpowered his embarrassment and urged him to snuggle up to the yokai. Shouto felt more tense. He didn't think this through, he realized, as Izuku's smaller but sturdy body felt close and very intimate under the blankets. It was then that it occurred to him that they were alone, snuggled up in the dark in Izuku's bed, and in an arrangement that was much more private than was probably appropriate for a god and their familiar. Izuku's head was resting nicely against his collarbone, his fluffy green hair tickling his throat. Their legs were fitted together, one of Izuku's fit comfortably between his ankles. Shouto kept his arms awkwardly to his sides, while Izuku seemed to settle with keeping his hands curled up by his own chest. He almost moved away, feeling wrong, like he was taking advantage of the cuddly boy. Izuku was a touchy person. It was something Head noticed almost right away. When he talked to people, it was common for him to touch the person's arm around his coworkers or shrine spirits. He was often hugging them whenever he greeted them or just felt happy. It was part of what made Izuku so special, but also what made Shouto realize that he was taking advantage of Izuku's friendliness. As little as he knew about friendships, the yokai was pretty sure that cuddling in their bed in the dark in the middle of a thunderstorm crossed some kind of line. Can you tell me more about the Ida family? Izuku asked after another growl of thunder had him clutching at the fabric of Shouto's shirt. Shouto hesitated for a moment, hand hovering before he gave in, and let his fingers run through Izuku's soft, unruly hair that smelled clean and almost floral. He told himself he was just comforting the frightened young man. He was just being a good friend. This wasn't for himself. The growing pressure in his chest didn't mean anything. Izuku was a human, Shouto reminded himself, and despite what he and Prince Katsuki might have believed, humans and yokai couldn't be together. He rolled away from Izuku and laid flat on his back, trying to ignore Izuku's little disappointed grunt at the loss of contact, and how it made his heart flutter. What would you like to know about them? You said you were friends with the youngest. Not friends. Shouto turned his head to look at Izuku. It was a little hard to see him in the dark, but the faint light behind him illuminated his hair like he was glowing, and he could still see his shining eyes and knew they were watching him closely. He looked back up at the canopy over Izuku's bed. He and Mama-sama were very close actually, so he was over quite a bit to visit her. I think he may have been in love with her, to be honest. But when I bring it up with her, Shed, just tell me I'm naive about those kinds of things. So I think she loved him back. Izuku smiled a little to himself. I'm sure he considered you to be his friend too. Tenya is an odd man, kind, very hardworking. But I don't think he's interested in friends. He puts his duties first, and besides Mama-sama, I don't think he had many friends. Even he and his familiar didn't seem that close. When did you last see him? Izuku asked softly. The yokai considered, thinking back to when he was alone without Mama-sama or Izuku. He visited a few times after Mama-sama disappeared. Tenya was just as motivated to find her as I was, if not more. But I think he gave up, and he stopped coming around here as well. I'm sorry. Don't be, Shouto insisted, genuinely unhurt. Like I said, we weren't friends still, though I am a little concerned about the Adas. This storm is getting... He winced as another strike of lightning shook the shrine. Izuku shimmied himself shyly closer to Shouto, who sighed and continued, worse. This is really bad. I don't know if I'll be able to sleep tonight, and I have a morning shift tomorrow. Izuku groaned, moving the pillow he laid on to slam into his own face. Shouto turned on his side letting out a small laugh at Izuku's frustration. Maybe I can help. He moved the pillow away from his face, just enough to peek up at Shouto. The smirk on the yokai's face, making Izuku blush. Sure, let me get the girls. I think they'll want to be a part of this too, he said, sliding out of the blankets and hurrying out of the bedroom. Izuku waited a second for Shouto to leave, and then put the pillow back over his face and screamed into it. He was so warm and close. He looked so cute and embarrassed. And he smelt so good. Shouto soon returned to Izuku's room, Ochako and Tsuyu trailing behind and clinging tightly to his red and white tail. Like it was a rope that was guiding them, they all squished into Izuku's bed, Shouto back on the right side of Izuku. While the two shrine spirits gathered by their legs, Ochako was still visibly shaken by the thunderous storm right outside their shrine, and Tsuyu, who usually looked so unfazed by things, was also clearly upset, never letting go of Ochako's hand as they sat and looked at Shouto with expectant but concerned gazes. I can create a small barrier similar to that snake yokai's, but nowhere near as large or strong. Just enough to create a small soundproof bubble, Shouto explained to them, voice icy. As he mentioned Hitoshi, the shrine spirits didn't seem surprised at all, but their eyes lit up in gratitude at the idea of a soundproof barrier. Izuku, on the other hand, grinned, leaning into Shouto with his innocent excitement. You can do that? That's amazing. He blinked up at Shouto with awe. Shouto's cheeks burned, and he had to look away only to make eye contact with the girls, who both had mischievous smirks on their faces. He pouted, deciding to just stare into his lap. Instead, it's nothing too incredible. It really wears me out to do, and so I'm probably going to be sleeping for most of tomorrow. If that's all right. He looked up at Izuku for confirmation, looking to the land god through his long lashes. Izuku stiffened, his cheeks turning pink for a reason Shouto couldn't understand, because there was nothing for Izuku to be embarrassed about. And he nodded his green head vigorously. Of course, if you want to do this, then take all the rest that y'all need, Shouto. I'm more than happy to put you all at ease, if at least for a little. While he said, giving them all a small reserved smile before sitting up more straight, his red and white tail wrapped around his crossed legs, his fox ears pointed up and focused as his eyes closed and brows furrowed slightly in concentration. He put his palms together, bringing them to his chest. As he let out a deep long exhale, a clear hazy orb formed around his hands, glowing slightly in the dark, barely lit room. A single trail of sweat ran down Shouto's neck as he took another deep breath, the little sphere slowly growing with every exhale. The shrine spirits and Izuku all watched in silence, breathing quietly in deep breaths with Shouto, as they watched the barrier get larger and larger until it stopped just as it surrounded the entire bed. I don't hear any more thunder, Kiro. Tsuyu broke the silence, tapping her chin in observation. I don't even hear the rain. Incredible, Master. Shouto was curled over himself, his fox ears flat and droopy, while he panted heavily. Ochako handed him a water bottle Shed brought with her in a small bag, and he thanked her roughly before gulping down the entire thing. He let out a worn-out sigh, flopping back down on the bed beside Izuku. His face ended up sinking into the side of Izuku's thigh, but he was too exhausted to bother moving, so he just breathed into Izuku's sweatpants. Thank you, Shouto, the land god said, tone fond, as he brought a hand down on Shouto's head gently. Shouto breathed out in relief, scooting himself closer to Izuku and dropping his head in his lap. He nudged Izuku's hand like an old dog would, practically begging to be pet. Izuku giggles behind one hand, while stroking Shouto's soft two-toned hair with the other. The two girls watched quietly, sweet smiles on their faces. Soon Shouto was breathing steadily, his body relaxed, and sleeping comfortably as Izuku continued to play with his hair and ears. Ochako laid a blanket over Tsuyu's small sleeping frame before crawling over to Izuku and snuggling up against his other side. He's like a kitten, huh? So cuddly when he's tired, she whispered, her rosy cheeks even rounder as she grinned. Izuku chuckled softly, pausing to admire how velvety Shouto's fox ears were. He lightly rubbed the red one between his fingers, wondering what it was like to have animal ears. Ochako continued to stare at Izuku's face until he finally grew a little self-conscious, but she looked away innocently. Nothing. He raised an eyebrow, feeling too tired for her games. No, what you're very obvious is all, she cooed, looking at her nails as if they were the most interesting thing in the world. So I was just observing, that's it. He felt his face heat up and scratched the back of his neck nervously as he half laughed. I don't know what you mean. Cut the crap, Izuku-sama. Ochako sang the last part, deliberately trying to irritate him as she smirked. It's just you and me, these two can sleep like rocks. So tell me the truth, you like Master Shouto, huh? Izuku moved his hand from Shouto's head to hide his face behind both hands. He groaned in embarrassment, feeling himself turn red all the way to the tips of his ears. She giggled mischievously from beside him, patting Izuku's back comfortingly. He peeked down at the sleeping yokai, heart fluttering at the sight of his handsome, peaceful face. Ochakachin, Izuku whimpered, slowly dropping his hands from his face and back into Shouto's hair. I don't like him, she frowned, nose scrunching up in confusion. But I don't like him because he gently cut her off, stroking the yokai's red hairs before shyly feeling the edge of his scar slightly rough beneath his fingers. Because I love him, I think. Her mouth turned into a small O shape before her already pink cheeks darkened, and she smiled sweetly, putting her hands to her cheeks to hold her face. Ooh, oh, Izuku, so happy, he laughed. Then a sad laugh that hurt her as said with defeat. Why though this is Shouto, you know how he feels 𝗵𝗃 He's never going to love me back. His laugh turned into a half sob, as suddenly his eyes welled up in tears. He rubbed them away with his arms trying to hide them. But the brown-haired shrine spirit already saw. She floated up to his head, her feet just slightly off the bed. As she patted his green curls and sighed Izuku, she pulled his head into her tiny chest, trying to hold him despite her small size. That's not true, it is, he quietly sobbed, letting his face get wet as large tears began to roll down his rosy freckled cheeks. I've tried to ignore it, I've tried to focus on just being his friend and a good land god. But it's so hard when every time he even just looks at me, I just want to take his face in my hands and kiss him. Ochako poked him hard in the cheek, causing him to wince and stare at her in confusion. Her large dolly eyes were fierce as she glared at him so adorably that he would have laughed if he wasn't so heartbroken. She put her hands on her hips and huffed in frustration. Izuku Midoriya, you are a big dummy if you think he doesn't feel the same way. She pointed to the sleeping fox man in his lap. And he's also a big dummy too for being so stupid about his no humans rule. Ugh. What an idiot, he loves you too, Izuku. You should have seen the way he acted when you were gone with that crummy snake. She threw her arms in the air dramatically. It was even worse than when Mama-sama had left. Then he was just depressing, we all were. But you were gone for not even a day, and I've never ever seen him so miserable and so desperate. She was practically yelling at this point. And he pulled her down from the air to try and quiet her. You're going to wake them, he hissed. I want Thayer out cold, she muttered, kicking Shouto lightly in the ribs for good measure. See. Izuku laid back against the headboard of the bed, keeping his hands on the fox. I really want to believe you. I can't even imagine what it would be like to just love him. I feel selfish even thinking about it, cause that's not fair to him. You know, he's my friend, all I want to do is make him happy. And he feels the same, she insisted, going back to her spot, snuggled up in Izuku's side. That's only because he's my familiar. No, it's not, it is. You're so stubborn, she murmured. You could quit being the land god right now. And the way he feels about you would not change. Besides feeling sad, of course, we'd all be devastated if you left us. Izuku put an arm around her and pulled her closer. I wouldn't dream of it. He said, honestly, this shrine is my home. And I meant it when I said I'm going to do my best to be the best god this shrine's ever had. Ochako smiled back at him, yawning softly. I know, I believe it. We should sleep. While it's nice and quiet, don't want to waste Shouto's hard work. After all, Izuku winced, feeling guilty for staying up and talking to Ochako, who was also probably pretty exhausted. He felt her nod beside him. Good night, Izuku. Good night, Ochako-chan. Thank you for everything. Letting his eyes finally close, he soon fell fast asleep. Meanwhile, in the middle of the raging storm, a lightning god and messenger goddess mourned the death of their son, who was brutally murdered by a vicious, bloodthirsty yokai. They clung to each other, crying out in pain, as they wept tears of lightning and rain, sending storms all over the land without a care, because their beloved son was gone. And nothing else mattered. So distracted by their despair, they'd forgotten about their youngest son, who was mourning in his own way. With cold, empty eyes, Tenya ran through the lightning, dodging each and every deadly strike like it was second nature. He ignored the burning in his chest from running for too long, ignored the way his legs ached, and begged him to stop and rest, because he had only one thing on his mind: to get revenge on his brother's killer. Denki was in a sour mood. Izuku, he felt he had no place calling out the blonde young man who grumbled and complained about every single thing he was doing. They weren't close enough friends just yet for him to feel comfortable doing so. But Mina, on the other hand, had no problems whatsoever when Denki roughly bumped into Hanta. Without so much as an apology, the girl had had enough. Stop being a little bitch. Mina finally spat out, swatting the bitter blonde in the head with a roll of paper towels. He dropped the vacuum handle in surprise, letting it fall loudly to the floor as he muttered out curses, but otherwise ignored the pink-haired girl who stood watching him, hands on her hips. He shut off the vacuum, then left it plugged in and laying on the floor. As he marched off to the bathrooms, Izuku observed his friend's curiously green eyes wide with interest, but also slightly cautious. It was unlike Denki to be so upset, unlike Mina to push others despite how blunt she could be. And it was even weirder for Hanta to not give any commentary at all. Instead, he continued on dusting the furniture as if his best friend was perfectly normal. The only sign that he was bothered by the situation was the sad frown on his normally smiling face. Since the shift had started, Denki had been off. Well, all of the trio had seemed off. But especially Denki. He rolled his eyes at every instruction. Even when Aizawa threatened to write him up for his attitude when Tetsu asked him for some help carrying some equipment up to the third floor, Denki waved him off and told him to ask Hanta instead. Most peculiar of all, though, was when Kyoyuka came into the building. And he didn't even glance up at her. Izuku frowned, then hurried to find Mina and ask what was going on. Oh, hi, Izuku, she said softly, her smile worn and tired. What's up? Everything okay? He asked, reaching a hand out to touch her arm. You seem a bit sad, and Denki is clearly upset about something. She looked to the side, biting her lip. Izuku suddenly felt bad, like he was being too intrusive. So he moved his arm away and stepped back. I'll forget what I said. It's really none of my business. And I know you guys aren't that close to me, so sorry for butting in. Jessamina blinked at him in shock before letting out a loud laugh, interrupting his nervous ramble. She closed the distance between them and hugged Izuku tight. First of all, you are a close friend to us, so don't feel bad. I feel bad, you see, it's kind of my fault. Denki is so mad right now. Izuku let out a deep breath, letting his shoulders relax before he asked, what do you mean? So yesterday, we were hanging out along with our friend I and his new boyfriend, and we invited Kayuka along too, and things were going well. But then that nasty storm started up, so we all decided to head out. Izuku nodded his head in understanding, remembering the awful thunder and lightning the night before. And as Kayuka was leaving, I said, oh Denki, didn't you have something to ask Kayuka? Izuku winced, knowing where this was going. Oh. Yeah, the pink-haired girl sighed, slumping against the wall. I shouldn't have put him on the spot like that. He got super flustered, basically screamed at her to go out on a date with him. Plus, she seemed really anxious to get home, so the timing was just bad. She had barely even looked at him, just said a quick sorry no, and then fled out the door. He was really shocked and really hurt. He doesn't have to take it out on everyone around him, though. Izuku crossed his arms, pouting slightly. But I get why he's upset. Did you all get much sleep too with that storm? She shook her head, pink curls bouncing. Not really, it was so bad, and it really doesn't help any of our moods. You and Shouto live outside of the city, right? I heard it was really bad out in the forest. Izuku smiled fondly, turning away so Mina wouldn't see his cheeks turn pink. As he thought of Shouto, it was pretty bad. But we still managed to sleep okay since the night before Shouto had been passed out cold. His barrier was perfectly successful in keeping out the booming noises, so the four of them had slept well. Still, Izuku felt wrong, like he needed to do something to take care of Shouto Ochako. And Tsuyu promised to watch over him. While Izuku went to work, his head considered calling in sick to take care of the exhausted fox yokai. There's no need to do that, Izuku. Tsuyu had croaked. He's just going to sleep the whole time, so you may as well go and make some money than sit around here all day. Izuku couldn't argue with that, so had gone to work. On his way home, he decided to make a quick stop at the grocery store to get treats for everyone back at the shrine. He walked down the cool aisles, enjoying the relaxing atmosphere of cheery pop songs playing softly in the background, and the light hum of electricity from the freezers. Izuku sighed at the rush of cold air that hit him as he opened the freezer door, reminding him of a certain cold man that was waiting for him. His eyes wandered from the fruity popsicles to the ice cream sandwiches before landing on the minty-colored box of ice cream mochi, with mostly Ochako in mind. Knowing how much she loved mochi, he plucked the box from its place on the shelf, and then hurried to the register to make his purchase. As the cashier handed him his change, the bells chimed to the side of Izuku, signaling that someone else had come in. He looked up naturally, a polite smile already on his face, as he made eye contact with the straight-faced man, his eyes hard to see with the light reflecting off of his glasses. Without thinking much of it, he turned back to the cashier to say goodbye, and then went out the door, bells chiming lightly behind him. Had gotten a few feet away before there was a loud cough behind him. The cough startled him. He clutched at his shirt as he turned to see the same man from the store standing behind him. It was only then did Izuku notice the traditional Haori jacket he wore, and had to suppress a groan. Great, he thought. More yokai, are you Izuku? Midoriya, the tall, broad-shouldered man, asked, his voice somewhat disbelieving. Izuku nodded, taking a step back, as he responded with suspicion, yes. How can I help you? He examined Izuku once more, hand on his chin in thought, before he said more to himself. Yes, that's definitely the land god mark. I just can't believe Mama-sama picked someone as unimpressive as you. Hey, Izuku frowned in offense. Who are you? The man crossed his large arms over his chest, frowning back at Izuku despite his stern expression. He was handsome, and stood with tall, prideful posture. His hair was a dark blue, neat and combed to the side with a slick undercut. He had bold eyebrows that appeared almost pointed at the ends, and a strong jaw that made him appear older than he may have been. He narrowed his dark blue eyes at Izuku. My name is Tenya Ida, youngest son of the Ida family and a rabbit yokai. But more importantly, a dedicated messenger, and today, Izuku-sama, I bring you an important message. From who? Izuku asked in shock, but also relief that this man was the yokai Shouto had brought up the previous night. Maybe he wasn't in danger. Then his grip on his grocery bag relaxed a little. From me, Tenya barked, his voice just a little too loud. I'm here to relieve you of your duty as land god. Someone like you isn't cut out for such an important job. But I, on the other hand, would be perfect to serve as the land god in Mama-sama's place. Wait a second. Izuku took another step back. No, it's okay. She chose me, and I want to be the land god. The shrine is my home. Tenya followed, moving his arms in large chopping motions. As he spoke, don't let your pride and greed for power get to your head. A measly human like you is not worthy of such a title. I promise you, I will do much better as Mama-sama's friend. And he paused, cheeks turning pink, before he boldly declared, and lover, I deserve the mark of the land god, not you. His determination was evident in his loud voice and wild gestures. Izuku understood that there was no use trying to reason with the yokai, so he tried to formulate some kind of plan of attack. At first he considered running away, but he remembered Shouto telling him that Tenya was the fastest messenger he knew. And that meant there was no way he'd be able to outrun him. He sat down the grocery bag and straightened his own posture to somewhat match Tenya's. "I won't let you take it," he said firmly, looking up at the taller man. "I apologize then, but it'll just have to." Tenya was cut off by Izuku suddenly closing the space between them, throwing his fist straight into Tenya's stomach. His body glowed with power like he had when stopping Prince Katsuki from fighting Shouto. Tenya flew back, sliding painfully on the sidewalk before he quickly got up, somewhat winded. But more shocked than anything else, he bent his legs and then ran at Izuku's speed, so alarmingly quick that Izuku didn't even have time to bring his arms up and block himself. As he was harshly tackled to the ground, Izuku let out a sharp cry of pain as he hit the floor, Tenya's heavy body slamming into him. "I didn't expect that," Tenya growled, gripping Izuku's jaw. "I don't have time to play around with you, Izuku Midoriya. It's time I take your mark. Enjoy your life again." As a regular human, his large hand hovered over Izuku's face, blocking the young man's vision and casting a dark shadow over his face. Tenya almost hesitated, face dropping, as he saw the hurt in Izuku's own expression. His mouth was open in protest, eyes wide and watering, as he knew there was nothing he could do to stop the stronger yokai. But then the sight of Tenya's dead older brother flashed through the yokai's mind, and with a palm to Izuku's forehead, he summoned the glowing mark out of the human, and then placed it into his own temple. "I'm sorry, Izuku," he said, getting off of the boy who laid with silent tears of anger streaming down his face. "But that shrine and fox familiar are rightfully mine." Izuku sat up, wiping the tears from his face. Before he could say another word to the yokai, Tenya was sprinting away in the blink of an eye. Not giving up," he choked out, standing up and brushing himself off before he ran down the path to the shrine. He knew Tenya was going to get there long before he would. But still, he ran his hardest to get to the shrine, forgetting about the recently bought ice cream mochi. He wasn't going to give up his home that easily. Waking up was a difficult task. Head lay in bed, aware of his surroundings, and his wiggling toes could smell Izuku from the blankets, hear the girls out in another room giggling amongst themselves. But his eyes remained shut just a little longer. He thought to himself, breathing slowly and eveningly as his energy came back to him. Slowly, Shouto opened one eye, the right unscarred one, looking at nothing in particular, as he wondered lazily what time it was with his single open eye. He glanced over to the tiny clock on Izuku's beside table, and then closed his eye, letting out a breath of contentment. Izuku would be home soon. They'd have a delicious dinner of some sorts, maybe soba again, and then they could go back to bed, and all would be well. The yokai pushed himself to get up, sitting up slowly and leaning against the headboard, trying to ignore the slight throbbing in his head. He reached for the water bottle, pausing as his fingers just barely touched the cool plastic. His white fox ear twitched, his eyes narrowed, and he straightened up. Something was different off him, not a familiar, he whispered to himself, eyes widening in shock as he looked at his wrists. The feeling was so slight, one he only recognized because Head felt it once before, right before Izuku had shown up at the shrine as a familiar. It was like Head had a light thread tied around his wrist, an almost unnoticeable weight that meant something. The same night Izuku had appeared at the shrine with Mama-sama's landmark, he had also noticed his wrists felt slightly lighter, almost naked. He didn't understand why until Head accidentally signed the familiar contract with Izuku, and the sensation on his wrists returned. Now, sitting alone in Izuku's bed, he realized the same feeling was gone. He wasn't a familiar, which meant Izuku was no longer the land god. Shouto threw the blankets off, scrambling off of the bed, and clumsily hitting the floor with a loud thump. He scratched at the floor, clawing his way back up as he ripped open the bedroom door and flew down the hall. His heart beat loud and fast in his ears, his throat tightening painfully as he began to panic. Izuku wasn't the land god. There was a few different reasons why that, maybe all of them making Shouto feel sick to his stomach. One he couldn't bear to think of was that Izuku was dead. His eyes stung just at the thought, so he quickly dismissed that possibility. Another was that someone had either taken the land god mark from him or had given it away. That wasn't ideal either. But at least that meant Izuku was alive and hopefully safe. Just as he scrambled into the kitchen, startling Tsuyu, but not yet alerting Ochako, they felt the land god's presence enter the shrine. Izuku is home. Ochako grinned, unaware of Shouto's panic state. Tsuyu was more observant, staring wide-eyed with confusion at Shouto as he stared at her back, his eyes wide and face pale like Head just seen a ghost. They heard footsteps coming closer to the door, each step louder and closer, making him want to vomit. "It's not Izuku," he choked out, gripping one of the kitchen chairs tightly, his right hand already starting to form a thin sheen of ice over the brown wood. The door slowly opened, revealing the land god, or at least someone who had the mark of the land god, but was definitely someone else much larger than Izuku. The shrine spirits gasped in alarm, while Shouto's mouth dropped open in shock. Tenya Ido walked in proudly, his head held high as he then looked around the room. Something in his eyes, possibly the lack of warmth they usually had, made Shouto stiffen. "The new land god, I hope you will serve me with the same dedication and respect that you gave to Mama-sama and the human Izuku." The two shrine spirits turned to look back at Shouto, eyes wide with fear, as he continued, voice low and growling, "The human's name is Izuku, and he is our land god. What did you do to him?" "Calm down, Shouto," Tenya sighed, pulling out a chair across from the bristling fox, and sat down. "He's fine. I didn't harm him despite how much he may have wanted to harm me. Sit down, please. He beckoned to the chair Shouto was gripping. Shouto's eyes pierced into Tenya's. But he stayed composed and waited patiently for Shouto to take a seat. After a few seconds of consideration, Shouto pulled out his own chair and sat, arms folded over his chest stiffly as he glared at Tenya. The blue-haired man leaned back, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he combed a large hand through his bangs. 𝗵𝗃 has been gone for about 20 years. Now Shouto, this shrine needs a much more fitting god than some human. 𝗵𝗃 picked him, not you. Tenya. Shouto snapped. It must have been a mistake. Then he reasoned calmly, taking off his silver glasses to wipe at the lenses. As he continued, I'm now going to take over, give this shrine a strong god like it deserves. 𝗵𝗃 deserves that. Do you not agree? I humbly ask that y'all serve as my familiar as well. Shouto, you were incredible for 𝗵𝗃, and this shrine needs a servant like you. I refuse, Shouto said, voice cold. Izuku's familiar. Not yours, not anymore. You're not. Tenya frowned. Are you really going to abandon this shrine for some human? Not abandoning anything, Shouto suddenly yelled, standing up and slamming his hands hard on the innocent wood table. The room went silent, the temperature suddenly dropping as Shouto shook in anger. Shivering slightly, the shrine spirits held their breaths and observed the conversation with nervous expressions, while Tenya's eyes widened in surprise before his frown continued to deepen into a look of great disappointment. Shouto stood up straight, bringing his hands to his chest in subtle embarrassment, as he said in a softer tone, I promised to serve this shrine under the care of 𝗵𝗃, and then she passed the mark on, and I made a contract to serve Izuku. My loyalty is with them and their wishes, and to the wishes of these wonderful shrine spirits. He beckoned to Ochako and Tsuyu, who smiled sadly. But my loyalty isn't to the shrine itself. If you are the land god Tenya, I refuse to serve you. Tenya stared up at Shouto with an expression of solemn irritation before swallowing loudly and turning his attention to the shrine spirits. You two please grab the box I left out on the front steps. It's on the heavy side. But if I remember correctly, one of you can make things float, so that should be no problem. They hesitated a moment before Tsuyu elbowed Ochako in the side. And they both bowed low. Yes, Tenya-sama. Tsuyu headed for the door with Ochako close on her heels, both girls glancing back to give Shouto apologetic looks. They didn't want to serve Tenya. They agreed with everything Shouto had said. But they were required to obey the god of their shrine. Shouto and Tenya sat in uncomfortable silence as they waited, Shouto avoiding eye contact, his red and white tail swishing behind him irritably, while Tenya continued to blatantly stare at him, his jaw clenched hard and hands together on the table. The girls quickly returned with a large wooden crate, Tsuyu's long tongue wrapped around it to pull it along as Ochako sat on top, hands together. As she focused on keeping the box light and weightless, Tsuyu unwrapped her tongue and stepped back as Ochako released her powers, allowing the box to drop to the ground with a loud bang. She winced slightly, then bowed to Tenya. My apologies, Tenya-sama, she said to the floor. It was heavier than I realized. No worries. He barked, waving one hand in the air enthusiastically. Thank you for your work, ladies. Now I please ask that you give Shouto and I some privacy. It was evident they weren't happy with the idea of leaving Shouto, but obeyed nonetheless. Tenya got up from his seat and turned towards the box, lifting its heavy lid with ease before dropping it to the side. As he pulled out an object Shouto couldn't see as his body blocked the fox yokai's view, 2 large dark blue bunny ears and a white fluffy tail poofed out from Tenya. He sighed, then turned to face Shouto. I don't like showing my yokai traits, as you may know, he grumbled, holding what looked like a giant golden hammer to his chest. But using an item this strong and magical makes me lose some of my control in that department, unfortunately. I humbly ask that y'all still take me seriously in this appearance. While the rabbit ears flopping from his head weren't exactly the most masculine of traits, Shouto kind of liked how they look. He may have been biased, though, as he had his own animal yokai features. You're fine, he said, his gaze dropping to the hammer in Tenya's hands. What is that? He asked suspiciously. Tenya raised the golden hammer higher, turning it to show off its beautiful detailed embellishments. It's a lucky mallet. I'm borrowing it from the greatest. You may have heard of him, All Might, Shouto gasped, taking a step back, as if his presence would taint the holy object. And he just let you borrow it? He asked in disbelief. The rabbit yokai raised his head, proud. He and my parents are friends. I promised it was for a good cause, so he allowed me to borrow it for a short time. Good cause? Shouto glowered, his right hand beginning to form ice as he prepared himself for a fight. And what might that be, Tenya? Call me Tenya-sama. Now Shouto, the man smirked, lowering his face so that his glasses were more reflective and Shouto was unable to see his eyes through the lenses. And I needed it just in case you decided to refuse, so I could do this with a sudden burst of speed so fast that Shouto was unable to react in time. Ida dashed towards the yokai, lifted arms, holding the lucky mallet tight in both hands. As he swung it down in front of Shouto, the mallet never touched him. But it didn't need to, because even the act of just swinging it at him caused a puff of yellow thick smoke to form around him. When the smoke vanished, there stood Shouto Todoroki, perfectly intact, but also perfectly intact in the body of his former 4-year-old self. Turn me back right now, Tenya, damn it. The rabbit yokai looked down at the tiny fox child, a smug smirk on his face, as he only chuckled, only if y'all be my familiar. Young 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗪 huffed, turning away and stomping to the other room, where the shrine spirits were. He walked in angrily, his body feeling hot and uncomfortable, and small Ochako and Tsuyu turned at the sound of his entrance, both girls squealing in glee at the sight of him. To his dismay, he realized he was somehow shorter than them now, even his 𝗕𝗪𝙢𝗫 for his head ears not giving him the height he so desperately wished for. Master 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗪 screeched, rushing to him in an excited grin, her eyes level to his, making him feel incredibly wrong. Did Master Tenya do this to you? You're so small and adorable. Kiro Tsuyu added, her lips softly smiling with amusement. His voice was much higher than before, making him flush in embarrassment as he growled out, yes, he did this and refuses to turn me back unless I become his familiar. I don't at all understand why he's so against it, Tenya complained loudly, coming up behind Shouto and towering over him. Shouto, I'm going to ask you one more time. Would you please be my familiar, as I need your help, especially in completing a certain task? Or would you prefer I banish you from this shrine? Shouto, failing in looking at all menacing, but despite so still attempted to appear dangerous, as he adorably growled at Tenya, I refuse. Then out you go, little kit. Tenya grabbed Shouto by the collar of his yukata, as if he were picking up a kitten by the scruff of its neck, and marched for the front doorway. He drop-kicked Shouto out the door, booting him hard in the butt, and sending his little body flying across the gravel, where he bounced painfully, his red and white fluffy tail wrapped around him as he rolled pathetically, landing on his stomach. With a soft oof, Shouto lifted his head up to glare at Tenya as the rabbit yokai called out, come back to me when you're ready to help me, the offer is still available. Shouto lifted up his middle finger to the man before getting up and marching down the road and away from the shrine. His body felt bruised from his rough landing, and his insides still buzzed irritably with a strange heat that was beginning to make him feel dizzy. He brought up his cooler hand to his forehead to try and cool himself down, but the warmth only increased so much that his vision began to blur. A simple stick on the road caused him to stumble. He fell painfully on his hands and knees, but found himself without the energy to get back up as his eyes began to close and the world around him turned dark. Shouto almost thought he could hear Izuku's voice. The last thing Izuku expected to find in front of the shrine gates was a child. He wasn't even quite sure what it was, but what he did know was that it very closely resembled Shouto. The small fox yokai child laid in the gravel, scuffed up, and passed out almost peacefully like Shouto. His hair was split down the middle, a section of red and white. But what made Izuku so unsure of who this child was the lack of a scar on his clear round face. Izuku knelt down, gently picking the child off the floor and scooping him into his lap. He moved the bangs out of his eyes and held him gently against his chest, relieved to feel him breathing evenly, his eyebrows furrowed in his sleep, nose scrunching up cutely as Izuku began to notice how warm the child was. His face was also slightly flushed, so Izuku put a hand to his forehead and sighed. He has a fever, he frowned, gently nudging the fox child. Hey kid, wake up. The child stirred, grumbling slightly before he opened his large bright eyes. They were unmistakable, one a warm brown and the other a refreshing turquoise. It took a moment before the child's eyes widened in recognition, and he jumped out of Izuku's lap. Izuku, he gasped, voice high and so cute it was impossible to stop the smile from spreading across Izuku's freckled cheeks, even if his head felt dizzy with confusion. Shouto, is that you? Why are you so small, Tenya? Hey. Shouto began to sway, his eyes closing in pain as he fell forward back into Izuku's lap. He did this, God, my head hurts. Izuku cradled Shouto close and stood up comfortingly, combing through the yokai's hair. You have a fever, Shouto, you need medicine or rest or something. I'm guessing we can't go to the shrine. Shouto nestled closer, gripping Izuku's shirt. No, we can't. I don't want him to hurt you, and I've been banished because I refuse to be his familiar. That's why he did this. He glanced up at Izuku, voice a little softer, as he added, I'm so glad you're okay. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop him from taking the land god's mark from me. If I was only stronger, then maybe. Izuku, stop, he said, gently cutting off the teary-eyed boy. You can't help that you're a human. It's an unfair disadvantage that the yokai have over you. But you've been getting stronger. Well, figure this out, and next time I'll protect you, he said the last part softer, half-heartedly, as he seemed to remember the current state of his body. They walked in silence, heading back towards the city, as Shouto allowed himself to relax his burning fever, making him drowsy. Meanwhile, Izuku continued to stare at the small yokai in fascination. His head was spinning with questions, while he also had the strong urge to pull out his cell phone and take 100 pictures. Maybe when he's feeling better, he thought. Shouto, Izuku blurted out, biting his lip apologetically, as he realized he woke the yokai up. I was wondering, so are you the same? I mean, you recognize me, and you aren't talking like a little kid besides your voice, I guess. But I mean, your body is small, and I see your scar is gone, so are you just physically a child, or are you also mentally? And why did Tenya even do this to you? Is this a common thing to do for yokais? Or are you the fox? Gave a loud, frustrated sigh, rubbing his cheeks roughly, as he glared up at Izuku. Wait, please. This is too much and you're giving me a headache. I'm so sorry. Izuku cringed, instantly feeling guilt. This is just a little strange for me. I know, Shouto replied. He gave Izuku a cute little half smile that made his heart swell. Give me a second to process what you said. He adjusted himself so that his arms were around Izuku's neck. His head resting comfortably on his shoulder, Izuku snuggled his face into the side of Shouto's head, breathing him in with a shameless grin on his face. It was impossible to resist him like this. He was just too cute. The yokai closed his eyes, thinking over Izuku's questions before responding. No, this isn't a common thing. I'm going to assume Tenya did this to inconvenience me as an incentive to get me to be his familiar. If I agree, then hell turn me back. Izuku let out a hum of understanding, so Shouto continued mentally. It's the same. It's not like I've been reverted back to my former childlike self. It's just my physical body that has changed. Is your sudden sickness related to that? Or is it because of you using so much energy last night during the storm? Izuku asked in concern, rubbing gentle circles on the fox's back. Could be both, he muttered, but mostly from the stress of undergoing a change like this. It's really not good for my body. After trying to apologize again. But Shouto having none of it, Izuku let the yokai rest, continuing to hold him close and rub his back. Soothingly, his concern for Shouto grew, as even in his sleep, the fox's breathing seemed to worsen and his body temperature continued to go up to make things even worse. The sky had darkened with gray rain clouds. Cold droplets began to slowly drip onto the two before quickly turning into a downpour of heavy rain. Izuku ran for cover, trying his best to protect Shouto from the chilly rain. He hid in the doorway of an old empty restaurant, building its exterior covered in boards and graffiti. As softly as he could, he laid Shouto down on the cold concrete, so that he could take off his oversized jacket despite the freezing ground. He laid on. Shouto remained passed out, his eyebrows furrowed in discomfort and cheeks a dark shade of pink. A light sheen of sweat made his face shiny, a small fang sticking out from his upper lip as he frowned in his sleep. Izuku quickly removed his teal jacket, then gingerly wrapped it around Shouto as tight and snug as he could, like a swaddled baby. He brushed Shouto's bangs away from his damp forehead, admiring his childish face and soft baby cheeks, a frown on his own face, as he was unsure of what to do. Izuku considered his options. He couldn't just walk into a normal clinic or pharmacy, as that would only raise alarms and create more problems. If he just walked in with some weird fox-like humanoid creature, the thought made him shudder. They'd take Shouto away and experiment on him, and dissect him. Izuku shook his head, trying to regain focus. Hitoshi crossed his mind, but thinking of the snake yokai made his stomach flip in fear. He really wanted to avoid the man as much as possible. Thinking of yokais, he suddenly remembered someone that he could trust. Quickly pulling out his phone, Izuku typed out a text to Mina. Izuku, hey Mina, could you send me Kyoyuka's number? Her reply was almost instant, but her response only made Izuku huff in slight frustration. Mina, why Izuku, I need her help with something please, it's kinda urgent. Mina, okay sure, but you better tell me more later, K. Mina, Izuku, thanks Mina, you're a lifesaver. Mina NP. He quickly saved Kyoyuka's number to his contacts, then pressed the button to call her, nervously bringing the phone to his ear. As he listened to the slow ring, Shouto could hear two familiar voices talking. One was obviously Izuku, if his fast pace and nervously loud volume weren't already a dead giveaway. The other voice took him a moment longer to recognize, but soon he realized it was Kyoyuka Jiru. His entire body felt like it'd been hit by a truck. He was sore, his head was aching, every sound pounding in his head with an intensity that made his face scrunch up. As he tried to get up, he suddenly remembered the situation he was in. Oh Shouto, Izuku suddenly yelped, reaching forward to help the fox yokai sit up. Where are we? He muttered, rubbing at his eyes with one hand, while taking Izuku's with the other. The room was large, softly lit by a single lamp in the corner. Despite its grand size and expensive Gothic-style vintage furniture, it had a sense of comfort to it. Kyoyuka was standing by a window across the room, sipping what smelt like coffee from a purple mug. She turned to look at Shouto, frowning slightly. He couldn't tell if it was with concern or irritation. Welcome to my humble abode, she said with a flat voice, taking another sip before continuing. Izuku called me crying about how you were dying and had nowhere to go. The freckles boy blushed, slightly glaring at Kyoyuka in embarrassment. I wasn't. She smirked softly, setting her mug down on the top of a beautiful grand piano before making her way over to the silk couch they sat on. She sat in an armrest closer to Shouto. You feeling any better? We gave you some yokai medicine I had while you were passed out, she asked, resting her chin in her palm. Everything hurts, Shouto sighed, resting his back against the sofa. He looked over to Izuku, feeling a little distraught at their size differences. It was weird to be smaller than the green-haired boy, rather than Izuku's head comfortably able to rest on his shoulder. He found his own head not even high enough to reach his shoulder to even look at his face. He had to look up, which was incredibly bizarre. Kyoyuka and Izuku were talking, but Shouto was too tired and sick to really listen, so he continued to stare at Izuku in fascination. Izuku felt Shouto's gaze and looked down to meet his eyes. He gave the yokai a sweet smile, one that made his stomach flutter. He felt Izuku let go of his hand, missing the warm contact and feeling of having his small hand held, but sighed in content at how cool Izuku's hand felt on his forehead. Your fever has gone down a little, but you're still burning, Izuku pouted, removing his hand to stand up. Is it okay if I get him some water, Kyoka? Yeah, of course, she pointed behind Shouto kitchens. That way cups are in the cabinets above the sink. He nodded his head, hurrying away to grab Shouto some water. While waiting, Shouto tried to keep his eyes open, but his eyelids felt heavy with exhaustion. Izuku quickly returned, encouraged him to drink some more water, and then let him lay his head down in his comfortable lap. He snuggled into Izuku's leg, breathing in his familiar scent, and enjoyed the feeling of Izuku combing through his hair and scratching him softly behind the ears. Soon he was fast asleep again. You said your fucking name was Deku? Shouto blinked into the darkness, eyebrows furrowed, as he listened to the voices in the other room. He recognized the Dragon Prince right away. His snarling voice and vulgar language was easily distinguishable. Who he was talking to, however, was speaking much softer, nervous, even, and Shouto wasn't sure he could recognize them. With a soft groan, he tried to turn his head towards the doorway, finding his body to be sore and exhausted. He tried to remember what happened, faintly recalling his dad's angry face and roaring flames behind him. Oh, he remembered now. Had been looking for his mother, something he did routinely every week for months since she'd been banished by his father. Shouto had been searching for her in secret, successfully hiding the fact from his father, but unsuccessful in actually finding her. He refused to try and use his fox fire to find her, plus, according to his father, you couldn't find another fox yokai using the fox fire magic. After searching for her, head returned home to Endeavor waiting for him. Shouto, his deep voice growled. Tell me where you've been out. Shouto replied stiffly, his body already sweating with nerves and from the heat his father radiated just feet away. Endeavor approached him, slowly analyzing Shouto before leaning close mouth to the young yokai's red ear as he dangerously whispered, I know what you've been doing. Shouto didn't get the chance to respond, a startled cry breaking from his throat as Endeavor swung his large burning hand up and lifted Shouto by the neck. He tried to pull Endeavor's hand away, kicking his legs and struggling to breathe, but the fire yokai's grip only tightened, his foxtails swishing behind him in brilliant flames. Quit now, Shouto, Endeavor threatened. Because if you don't, you'll have to kill her before you can find her. He threw a few more punches, then tossed Shouto out. Shouto ran blindly until had fallen into a rushing river and eventually ended up barely conscious on a murky riverbank. Someone helped him, but he couldn't recall who. Just remembered that they were incredibly gentle, and now somehow he ended up with Prince Katsuki, a hot-headed but well-intentioned dragon yokai. The door slid open with a large slam, causing the other person to make a squeaking noise and jump back out of Shouto's line of vision. He managed to get a glimpse of green, but that was it. Prince Katsuki entered the room, his dark red eyes narrowed at Shouto, and a frown deep on his face. You're lucky. This Deku kid found you, you weak ass half and half fox, and you're lucky. I'm feeling generous today. You're probably too stupid to tell, but you're running a pretty high fever. And if this guy hadn't saved your ass, you would have been free pickings for some nasty hungry yokai, considering who your daddy is. He squatted down to get a closer look at the fox. I don't know what the fuck you were doing in that part of the forest, you shitty fox. But if I were you, I wouldn't do that again. I'll do my best, Shouto replied dryly, then glanced to the doorway. The other person was peeking, but the room was too dark, so he could only see a silhouette of curly hair. Is that Deku? At the mention of his name, the stranger yelped and hid away again. Prince Katsuki was saying something, but Shouto's head became fuzzy, and everything went black. This time, when he felt himself regain consciousness, he kept his eyes shut. Someone was close by, incoherently muttering to themselves while they moved about the room. Shouto held back a flinch as he felt a cold, wet rag dabbing gently at his head. The contact was refreshing and incredibly relieving, making him realize just how sick and weak his body felt. I've never seen him look so awful, the person whispered to themselves. That confused Shouto, as he was almost positive had never met anyone named Deku. He didn't meet many people in Generalas. He only actually interacted with others when he was forced to go with his father on his various escapades. Generally, those interactions didn't go so well. When he felt some kind of cream being applied to a fresh burn on his arm, he couldn't help opening his eyes to see who was being so kind to him. He wasn't used to this kind of treatment. After all, Shouto was shocked to see a human man fairly young as well. He had a scarf wrapped around his shoulders, covering half of his face from view, and his dark green bangs were pushed to the side. So really all of his face that was visible was a single bright emerald eye with long pretty lashes that blinked frequently as he continued to talk to himself, unaware of Shouto staring at him. The man removed his warm hands from Shouto's burn and turned his head, so Shouto quickly closed his eyes, holding his breath as he waited to see if had been caught. The man didn't seem to react, so Shouto slowly opened one eye to continue watching. The strange human head walked over to another side of the room and was arranging something on a tray. His body blocked Shouto's view, but he could hear ceramic being knocked together at the thought of food. His stomach grumbled loudly. Deku, as he started to call him in his head, froze, then slowly turned his head to look at Shouto from over his shoulder. This time Shouto stared boldly at the man, curious to see his reaction. A dark blush creeped out from beneath the scarf and Deku turned his head away, quickly looking down at the tray in his hands. He nervously walked over, keeping his head low to block his face, as he gingerly sat the tray down by his head. It had a bowl of some faint but delicious smelling soup, and a smaller bowl of what may have been water. Shouto could see the man's hands were shaking, and he felt a tinge of guilt. Whoever this man was, he seemed afraid of Shouto. Not going to hurt you, Shouto said. His voice came out sounding more irritated. Then he meant for it to. To his surprise, the man let out a short giggle. I know, he whispered softly, voice almost sounding fond. Do we know each other? Shouto asked in suspicion, trying to lift himself up to see the man's face clearer. No. Deku flinched, nervously stuttering, as he turned his face away from Shouto. I just happened to find you, is all. Shouto could sense he was lying, but didn't call him out. And how did you find Prince Katsuki? That was luck. Deku sighed, speaking more regularly as he said, I happened to find him after I found you passed out with a fever. I convinced him to help, so now you're here in one of his hideouts, as he called it. So we're not in the Bakugo Mountains? Then Shouto questioned, looking at the soup with sudden interest. I don't think so, Deku replied, then glanced over to Shouto. That's for you. It's not the most exciting meal, but hopefully it'll help you feel a little better. Shouto picked up the ceramic bowl, tilting it towards his lips as he sipped at the warm broth. It was some kind of chicken soup, rich and creamy, with pieces of chicken meat, carrot, and onion chopped into small bits. Deku was right, it wasn't exciting, but it did heat up his chilly body, and soon had finished the entire bowl. He put the bowl down, then drank the water before softly thanking Deku. Even with just one eye showing, Shouto could tell that Deku was smiling. It'll get you feeling all better soon, Shouto. Wake up, Shouto. His stomach grumbled loudly, the ache of hunger and dryness of his thirsting throat making him immediately forget whatever things he may have been dreaming about. Izuku helped the yokai sit up before giving him a glass of water. Shouto gulped it down, then gave Izuku a soft smile in thanks. You're looking a little better, he grinned, sweetly patting Shouto's head. The action was weird to him, until he remembered the state of his body. I may look it, but am not actually a child, he said defensively. Izuku yelped, pulling his hand back like had been burned, his face red with embarrassment. I know, I'm sorry, you're just so cute. And it was natural, and it's fine. Shouto sighed. You're fine. I'm just a little insecure being like this. I feel so weak. Being small doesn't make you weak, Izuku frowned, but then smiled faintly at the fox yokai. But I understand though, you'll feel better once you eat. I was going to go out and get some food. Actually, do you want anything in particular? A memory he just couldn't recall, but felt recently seemed to call out to him. Without hesitating, Shouto replied, chicken soup, please. Izuku brightened. Okay. I can make that. Actually, my mom used to always make that for me whenever I was sick. Okay, cool. He clapped his hands in childish excitement, getting up to leave the room. Kaiuka is here still. If you need anything, all right, I'll be back soon. In the doorway, he turned back to the fox child and called out, I'll get you feeling all better soon. Shouto. The words made him feel suddenly emotional, his chest swelling with feeling that he didn't understand, but made him feel sad as he watched Izuku leave. Where have I heard that before, he thought to himself. Despite the exhausting headache that kept him seated in the comfortable black sofa, Shouto felt too awake to try and get some more rest. He looked down at the empty glass cup he was holding, eyebrows furrowed as he glared at the cup's large appearance in his small delicate hands. With a slight pout, he brought up his right hand, feeling his body get a little colder as he tried to form ice in the palm of his hand. A small sphere of ice formed perfectly round and pretty as it glistened in the soft lamplight. But it only made Shouto sigh in dissatisfaction with his body in this form. He also seemed to have the same amount of abilities that he had as a child, meaning he really wasn't very strong, and if needed to, he wouldn't be much help in protecting Izuku. The thought puzzled him slightly. He questioned why he would even feel the need to protect Izuku despite his familiar contract being non-existent. Then of course he knew the answer. He cared about Izuku, and land god or not, he would always do everything in his power to protect him. They were friends. After all, the ice ball rolled out of his palm, dropping into the clear glass with a light thunk. There was a light cough behind him, so he turned his head slightly to see Kaiuka enter the living room. She plopped herself onto the seat beside him, giving him a polite half-smile before stretching her arms up with a small yawn. You look a little better, so Tenya, huh? That's not a good family to have issues with. It's not my fault there's an issue, Shouto said, voice laced with obvious irritation. Didn't say it was, she shrugged, bringing her knees up to her chest. As she then continued softly, why would an Ida want to be a land god though? No offense to Izuku. I mean, I even wanted to be the land god when I first met him too, you know. But I'm pretty lame as far as yokai go, banished crow. And also, why's an Ida's son want that? He's already of higher status than a measly land god. Shouto froze, staring at Kaiuka blankly as he processed what she said. It was true, Tenya was the son of two very powerful gods, which guaranteed him both riches and power, and he was already a well-known and respected messenger among yokai. Wanting a simple role like serving as a land god for a small unpopular shrine really didn't make any sense. Had mentioned Mama-sama saying he was doing it for her. But it had been 20 years since 𝗧𝗏 disappeared, and it felt kind of late for him to suddenly care about the well-being of the shrine itself. Tenya had obviously had feelings for Mama-sama back. When Shouto served as her familiar, he knew she loved Tenya back. But only platonically, as she had even teased him once, saying, "Oh Tenya, if only you were a beautiful woman, I could use a reliable person like you as a wife." His romantic advances were never reciprocated. But he never seemed entirely distraught over the fact, as he still continued to visit the shrine when he could, and spent time with Mama-sama as a caring friend. So why did he care so much about the shrine? Now do you think it has anything to do with that awful storm last night? Kaiuka hummed in thought, more to herself than to Shouto. Shouto's large round eyes widened in further realization. I'd forgotten about the storm with all of this going on. I should have asked him what the hell was up with his family. Children shouldn't swear, Fox, she teased, lightly glancing down at Shouto in amusement. But yeah, you should have. Something bad must have happened for them to freak out like that. And then for him to show up like out of the blue and just take the mark. Something's up. His face dropped in guilt, his hands clenching as he gritted his teeth and let out a long, frustrated breath. I was only thinking of myself and Izuku. Tenya is, or was, someone I could almost call a friend, at the least someone Mama-sama cared for. I should have listened to him better. I mean, I don't blame you. Kaiuka shrugged, playing with her blunt bangs absent-mindedly. As she continued, I'd be pretty defensive too. If I was in that situation, the whole thing's a mess. But yeah, kinda crappy of you to not ask him what's up. I need to go back, Shouto decided, standing up too quickly. He swayed on his feet, his large fluffy tail flicking behind him to help him regain balance. With an ungraceful wave of his arms, he stumbled onto his knees, his head knocking into the side of a nearby coffee table. Kaiuka watched the whole thing, muffling her giggles behind her hands. You okay there? She snorted, leaning down to look at the fox child who laid on the cool floor in shame. He pressed his nose to the ground, cheeks hot from more than just the fever, as he grumbled out, "I'll go after I eat some of Izuku's food." Good plan, Kaiuka laughed. Izuku returned shortly, 2 paper bags full of groceries carried almost protectively in his strong arms. His grin was wide, excited, but didn't quite reach his exhausted eyes and the dark circles underneath them. As soon as he entered Kaiuka's home, he set out for the kitchen, having her give him a small tour of where things were before he started cooking. Shouto half listened to their casual chatter from the living room sofa. As he sipped on water that he melted from his own little ice balls, he felt distracted. Izuku wouldn't be happy that Shouto was planning on going back to Tenya, knowing him he'd want to protect Shouto. But he couldn't bear the thought of Izuku getting hurt. He wasn't a land god anymore. He didn't have any extra abilities to strengthen him. If anything were to happen to him, Shouto knew he could never forgive himself. Kaiuka came back out alone as Izuku was still working in the kitchen. She sat in the armchair to the side, looking curiously at Shouto's dark expression. You okay? She asked, kindly, voice soft in a whisper, so that Izuku wouldn't hear them. His shoulders dropped in defeat. Izuku isn't going to be happy with me. Why wouldn't he be? I'm sure he'll be more than happy to help Tenya too. Shouto gave her a long look, and her eyes widened. Oh, you're not bringing him? It's too dangerous. Shouto dropped his head into his hands. And I can't do anything to protect him. While like this, she nodded her head in agreement, crossing her arms over her chest. True. And you know, if anything, this may be a good chance for him to get a regular life back. He could be like his friends. He wouldn't have to worry about yokai stuff anymore or deal with the work of being a god, right? Sometimes I envy those guys. Their lives are so innocent and naive. Shouto sat in silence. He hadn't considered that before. What if Izuku didn't even want to go back to being a god? He had a job now and reliable friends at work who could probably help him get a place to live pretty fast. Things would be safer too. Yet the thought of living in the shrine without Izuku made his shoulders drop even more. Kaiuka noticed and sighed loudly. I'd miss him. Though Shouto looked up at her, his sad childlike expression almost made her want to reach out and hug him. But it might be best for him. This isn't about me. It didn't take long for a delicious aroma to fill the house, making the gloomy weather outside feel considerably warmer. Izuku brought out a tray of bowls, each one a black ceramic filled with hot chicken soup. He set the tray gently on the coffee table, then moved each bowl to a different spot on the table, his large hands holding each bowl firmly. Shouto thanked him softly before dropping some ice balls into the soup and digging in the smell, incredibly inviting and making him eager. This is really good, Izuku, Kaiuka said, gratefully humming in content as she took another large bite. Perfect for a day like today. Green eyes flickered out the window, a frown forming on his usually cheery face as he nodded. I guess so, yeah, feels like the weather is getting worse again, though, but you're welcome, both of you. His attention turned to the small fox yokai. Everything okay while I was gone? Did you get more rest, Shouto? I didn't sleep, Shouto replied, looking away from Izuku's parental look of disappointment. But I did relax, and Kaiuka was good company. Aw, you're not so bad yourself, kid. She smirked, then lifted her bowl to her dark lips to swallow down the rest of the soup. She then excused herself, thanking Izuku once again for the soup before she hurried out of the room, shooting Shouto a knowing glance. He sighed, his small stomach suddenly feeling a little too full as he felt his nerves take over at just the thought of telling Izuku his new decision. Izuku he said softly, letting his spoon rest in the not-quite-empty bowl. He had already been watching Shouto, aware that something that wasn't his low fever and overall health was bothering him. Part of him considered that maybe it was due to outside, as the sky was darkening, and the clouds were thickening in dark gray bunches. It looked like the lightning may return soon, which made Izuku think of the shrine spirits. He missed them, and hoped they were safe and being treated kindly by Tenya. At Shouto's quiet voice, Izuku hummed in response, concerned, but patiently waiting to hear what the yokai had to say. Shouto looked up, large eyes bright behind his long, pretty lashes. It was hard not to smile. A little child. Shouto was so endearing and soft looking, especially when his frowning face came out looking more pouty than anything else. But then his firm words made Izuku's stomach drop. I'm going to go back to the shrine now, to Tenya by myself. Izuku tried to remain rational, though the dread and disappointment that he felt came out as his voice cracked out with emotion. But, why I can't stay like this? His small pale hands beckoned to himself. And I think I've been acting too brash. There's something else going on, I'm sure of it. The shrine may need my help as well as Tenya. He wasn't himself completely after all, and I need to fix things, but why alone? Izuku asked softly, looking down at his hands. As he felt his eyes begin to burn, he knew the answer. But he didn't want to hear it. Izuku. Shouto said his name like a sad sigh. It's not safe for you. You're a regular human now. And maybe this is better. Yeah, I'll be much safer. Now no more yokai after you or spirit world things putting you in unnecessary danger. You can have a normal life again. The words hurt more than Izuku expected. They sounded like excuses. Shouto's voice didn't even sound fully sincere when Head said them. Izuku kept his head low, shamefully hiding himself from Shouto's gaze, his eyes shut tight in angry frustration, trying but failing to keep the large tears from falling into his lap. Shouto was right. He was just a regular human. Now, meaning he wasn't special, and meaning that Shouto didn't care about him that much. After all, they didn't have the familiar contract bonding them anymore. Izuku knew it was too good to be true. There was no way that the yokai actually felt anything more for a boring, weak human like him. What if I don't want a normal life again? He sobbed out, his palms rubbing hard at his eyes, but unable to stop the tears streaming down his face. I don't care about being safer. I was so lonely before Shouto. I want to keep living at the shrine, taking care of it, and being there with everyone, with Ochako and Tsuyu, and especially with That's not what I meant. Shouto cut him off. Izuku looked up, shocked to see how heartbroken Shouto's face looked. He stood off of the couch, cheeks flushed slightly and eyebrows up in worry, as he leaned over the coffee table across from him to be a little closer to Izuku. The serious expression on his face looked much too mature for his current body. A small hand reached out from his warm side and waited for Izuku to take it. Once he did, somewhat marveled, and still not used to how small Shouto was, the fox continued. I just meant you can live a normal life again if you want to, but right now I need to do this by myself. I can't protect you like this. You need to stay here with Kyoka and wait for me if you'd like. But I promise, Izuku, that if you want me to, I will come back for you. He pulled away from Izuku and turned towards the doorway. On his way out, he added, but something is wrong with Tenya for sure. I can sense something dangerous is going to happen. And I don't want to involve you, and I just want you to know that you don't have to live your life like this. Like me. And if I don't come back. He stopped, appearing short underneath the doorframe, turning his head slightly to look back at Izuku. It was his left side that was facing him, red hair bright, and his turquoise eye shining on his clear, youthful face. His stare was intense, one that silenced any words that may have come stumbling out from Izuku's trembling lips. If I don't come back, then that means I failed, and am begging you not to come looking for me. Your safety is still my priority, familiar or not. Izuku watched him leave, silent tears falling down his freckled face. Kyoka drove Shouto to the shrine, both of them silent the entire way. The only time they spoke was when she offered him some more medicine, and then Head thanked her. She drove fast the entire ride, only about 5 minutes long with the speed she was going. When they arrived, she pulled off to the side and then locked the door, keeping Shouto from leaving right away, his eyebrows raised in interest, trying to keep himself from looking too irritated or impatient as he turned to her expectantly to hear what she had to say. Be careful, Shouto. She said, her cheeks a little pink with embarrassment as she looked at her hands on the steering wheel. I know we're not exactly friends, but Izuku is my friend. And if you end up dying, I don't want to have to deal with him crying all the time. Okay, he cries enough already as it is. He nodded, his head hard hurting a little at the mention of Izuku, who did cry a lot. I'll try to not die. Thank you, Kyoka. Shouto unlocked the door with a dull click, then swung open the car door to step out. With his height, he ended up more dropping from the car, but he landed smoothly on his feet, tail flicking behind him to help himself balance on the gravel. Before closing the door, he gave her a small smile. And not that it matters much, but I think at this point it's okay to call ourselves friends. She let out a laugh, a sweet smile on her face. As Shouto closed the door, he suppressed a groan. He didn't even realize from inside the car that it was raining again. Kyoka honked behind him, so he turned to look back at her. The windows were tinted, but he could see her waving hand behind the dark glass before she turned the car around, tires squeaking on the wet, gravelly road, and then drove away. He waited till the nice black vehicle was out of sight, Then he took a deep breath and marched proudly towards the shrine head, held more confidently than he actually felt. Shouto never actually made it into the shrine, instead just barely walking through the gates when he found Tenya leaving at the same time. He was a few yards ahead, looking towards the ground, his footsteps loud as he scowled. His eyebrows were deep, his expression much darker than Shouto was used to seeing on Tenya's usually much friendlier face. Tenya, Shouto called out, quickening his pace to meet the rabbit yokai. Where are you going, Shouto? The yokai looked up and yelled out in surprise, the relief evident as his face brightened and his body straightened up. He hurried to the fox yokai, his long strides making him reach Shouto much quicker than the smaller yokai had expected. Tenya's arms chopping up and down as he talked. So you've changed your mind? Perfect timing, as we need to go now. Wait, Tenya, Shouto groaned, already feeling his headache come rushing back at Tenya's loud voice. We need to talk, please. The tall yokai looked down at Shouto unsurely. Can it wait? I can go grab the mallet now and change you back. And then we really need to get going right away. He turned back towards the shrine, expecting Shouto to follow him. Go where? Shouto ran his fingers through his hair, his patience already running thin. Stop and slow down for once, Tenya, damn it. What is going on? When the rabbit yokai didn't respond, Shouto bent down to pick up a large rock and chucked it at the back of his blue-haired head. Tenya spun around fast, his cheeks flushed with anger. I don't have time for this. I need to avenge my brother Shouto. So if we don't go right now, I'm going to miss that chance. His murderer won't stay around here much longer. And from what I've heard, he never stays in one location for very long. His voice began to choke with passionate emotion as he gasped out, if we don't leave now, I may never have this opportunity ever again. I need to do this for Tensei. Shouto felt his stomach drop, the guilt and sorrow for Tenya hitting him like had been kicked in the stomach. Tenya, Tensei was murdered. God, I am so sorry. Everything made sense now. The horrible storm the night before from Tenya's parents or whole family, possibly Tenya's sudden desire to be a god, obviously to use whatever extra power he could get before trying to fight whoever the murderer was. No wonder he wanted Shouto to be his familiar. With a strong fox yokai like him, Tenya would have a huge advantage fighting whoever the killer was, and his urgency now, his dark expressions and hostility that wasn't usual for the normally gentle and overly polite yokai. It was clear what Tenya intended, and Shouto felt awful for not realizing it sooner. I've done my mourning already. What needs to happen now is justice. My brother must be avenged. He grabbed Shouto by his small arm, the strength of his tight grip painful against his skin. Let's hurry and switch you back, and then seal the contract and go. Shouto tried to pull away. I'm not going to be your familiar. What? Tenya's grip only tightened, making Shouto wince. Then why did you even come back? There was a sudden crack of thunder. It lit up the area for a second and showed Shouto how desperate Tenya looked. His eyes were red with tiredness, begging, pleading for help, and his usually neat hair looked unruly as his bangs stuck to his forehead from the light rain. I'll still help you, he insisted, eyes watering in pain. But I still meant what I said before. I only intend to serve Izuku. It's not the same, Tenya exclaimed, dragging Shouto up the shrine steps along with him. Gods are stronger when they have a familiar, especially one like you, Shouto. If you want be my familiar, then I hate to interrupt, but I heard some interesting gossip about a little bunny looking for me. A raspy voice spoke out, cutting off Tenya's demands. Something about him hoping to avenge his dearest big brother. Shouto let out a breath of relief as he felt Tenya let go of him. He rubbed at the red marks on his arm, frowning, as for a moment they reminded him of his past with his father before he remembered where he was and who he was with. Looking up, he saw that Tenya was pale, pupils dilated in fear as his mouth hung open in shock. Shouto turned around cautiously as he followed Tenya's gaze, not recognizing the strange but dangerous-looking yokai who stood before them. Stained, Tenya choked out, taking a step back and nearly tripping on the steps. I don't normally do personal visits, the yokai leered, a long thin tongue lashing out to lick his dry lips. But you sounded entertaining, as I do love a tragic story, so I thought I'd make an exception. Stain was a large yokai, his presence menacing and dark, as if a large shadow followed him. Wherever he went he stood with his body curled forward slightly, his long face angled down and white ghostly eyes narrowed like he was ready to attack at any moment, and judging by Tenya's disturbed expression, that may have been the case. His arms were wrapped in bandages, while around his neck and shoulders hung two long billowy red and white scarves. They looked like they may have once been expensive, made of royal fabric, but now they were torn and shredded from years of battling and killing. Behind him, strapped to his back, was a long black sword, and strapped to his chest was a set of 6 or 7 long knives. But what stood out the most to Shouto was the battered and beaten huge set of black feathery wings behind him. He's a Tengu, Shouto gasped, feeling his own blood run cold in fear as he thought back to his first encounter with Kyuuka Tengu. If strong enough were able to perform the blood curse, it was a deadly spell that required some sacrifice in order to work, but once performed made the target nearly defenseless. He remembered how awful it was when Kyuuka had done it to him, how cold and powerless had felt. If he and Tenya were to get trapped in the curse, they'd both be killed, as well as Ochako and Tsuyu inside the shrine. You can't hesitate, Tenya, Shouto whispered, taking a step closer to the larger rabbit yokai. If he performs the blood curse, we're all done for. Smart kid, Stain leered, his large mouth widening further. And his huge white teeth glinting cute too. It's a shame he has to die too. Just because someone got greedy and wanted to go looking for me like some pretend hero. His eyes narrowed as he looked closer at the rabbit yokai before they widened in realization. A sinister smile on his lips. And what's this? I see you have the mark of a land god. Why, it really is my lucky day. He winked at Tenya, then let his huge worn-out wings start to spread out behind him. Stop him, Tenya Shouto shouted, hitting both of his fists against Tenya's hips to wake him up from his frozen shock. Don't let him pull out any of his feathers. Tenya's startled color returning to his face and eyes widening before his face went fierce with determination. I'm going to avenge my brother and protect the innocent, he roared, dashing for Stain and reaching him in less than a second with a burst of his incredible speed. It was like a dance the way Tenya swung his large muscled legs with every kick and hop, and Stain swiftly dodged each one, throwing in a few failed slashes of his own as he held a knife in each one of his fists. They each kicked, slashed, dodged, moving around each other in quick, strong movements. But neither of them landing a hit. Shouto watched in despair, feeling utterly useless. And in the way, as he knew he wasn't strong enough to help fight the evil yokai, he was so distracted that he never noticed the two shrine spirits watching fearfully from the window behind him. They looked at each other, a silent agreement passing between them as they took each other's hands and vanished in a puff of smoke, going to someone they hoped they could count on to save them. Click, sniff. Click, sniff. Ugh, Izuku groaned, tossing the plastic remote on the couch beside him as he rubbed at his dribbling nose with his sleeve. I feel so useless. There was a loud boom of thunder, so loud and bright that he let out a shrill shriek as lightning lit up the world outside the window. Then as soon as it came, it was gone, and took all the lights out with it. The room fell silent. Now that the power had been shut off and Izuku was back to sitting alone in the dark living room, his cheeks were pale, eyes red and tired from crying, his running nose still flowing with sadness, while his eyes stung dry. Head tried to distract himself with something on TV, but found everything on to be more draining than helpful anyways. Like me, he cried, bringing his knees to his chest as he sighed. If only I could have been more helpful. I hope Shouto's getting along with Tenya okay right now. A sudden chill ran up his spine, making him tense. He looked around the room, anxiously, green eyes bright in the dark, as he searched for something, or someone, as he definitely didn't feel like he was alone anymore. But the room remained still. The only sounds were the wind blowing outside, the soft rain tapping the window pane, Izuku's soft breathing and tense beating heart, and the consistent tick of a clock from another room. He ran a hand through his bangs, closing his eyes and breathing deep as he tried to relax until Izuku jumped high up from his seat when a small alarm went off, signaling that the front door opened. Kayuka, he called out, nervously, cringing at the crack in his voice. She poked her head through the doorway before coming in, smiling sadly at Izuku and back. Are you doing all well? When did you two get here? The sudden surprise in her voice and wide eyes made him look around frantically. What are you talking about? He demanded. You can't see them, huh? She frowned, looking just to the right of Izuku, nodding her head, as if being told something, while she said to the confused boy, here. This will help. Kayuka came around the couch, standing by the armrest as she pulled off her leather jacket and draped it over the side. She glanced at Izuku, shortly, cheeks pink as she bit her bottom lip in slight embarrassment. Then, with a confident huff of breath, she raised her arms and let out her huge black feathery wings. Izuku gaped in amazement, having almost forgotten how large and beautiful Kayuka's wings were. A soft giggle escaped her throat at the look of wonder on his puffy face. She reached behind herself to pluck out a soft feather from the bottom of her wing, then handed the feather to Izuku. He let it rest gently in the palms of his hand, so close to his face that his nose was almost touching it as he examined the dark shimmery feather closely. As soon as he grasped it more firmly between his thumb and index finger, two recognizable figures suddenly appeared by his sides. Izuku Ochako wailed, her sobbing voice loud in the room. Where did you come from, and what's wrong? He gasped, reaching out to hold her closely as she cried into his chest. Keeping the black feather clutched tight in his left hand, Tsuyu clutched his sleeve on his other side, her large eyes watery and face pale. We've been here for a few minutes now, but you couldn't see us, Kiro. With a yokai possession in your hands, you can see them now, Kayuka explained to Izuku, her arms crossed over her chest and eyebrows deep in concern, as she then asked the shrine spirits. Your shrine spirits, right? Why are you two here instead of at the land god's shrine? Tsuyu looked to Ochako, but she was too busy staining Izuku's shirt with her tears. So the frog-like girl answered the shrine. Kiro, Master Shouto, and Tenya-sama as well. They are being attacked. Izuku's eyes grew wide in fear as his face paled. Images of Shouto being hurt, his small child form laying unmoving, and the shrine destroyed behind him flashed through Izuku's panicking mind. His eyes watered at the thought of Shouto being harmed. But he stood up abruptly, still holding Ochako to his chest despite his teary eyes. His expression was fierce and determined. I need to help them, he said through gritted teeth as he headed for the door. But Kayuka grabbed his shoulder hard and pulled him back. Wait, she cried, looking back to Tsuyu, who looked both scared and yet eager to follow Izuku out. You can't just run in blindly. Izuku, who was attacking them. Ochako lifted her face from Izuku's shirt, her jaw clenched as she whispered a scary-looking Tengu name, Stain. Izuku was surprised to hear Kyoyuka's sharp inhale of breath from beside him. He looked to her immediately concerned at the way she stiffened, and how grave her face looked especially in the dark. She reached a hand out for him, pulling Izuku closer before wrapping her arms around his shoulders and hugging him. Ochako squished between them. "You could die, Izuku," she whispered sadly as she hugged him tight. "Stain was banished long before I was. But I know of him and his evil wrath. He's a cold-blooded murderer, and he will not hesitate to kill any of you." He frowned as she pulled away, touched, but also concerned by her uncharacteristic affection. "What do I need to know about him?" She pulled Izuku to sit back down on the silk couches before she explained, "I was young when he was banished. But I remember hearing the elders speak about him. His blood curse was different, unlike me or other Tengu. He doesn't need to sacrifice his own blood to take victims. Instead, all he has to do is simply taste the blood of who he wants to paralyze. And then he has control over them, and unlike me and other Tengu, he can take control over multiple people at the same time. I heard a rumor that he once slaughtered an entire village at once." Izuku bit his lip and nodded, encouraging her to continue. "So whatever you do, don't get cut by him. As soon as you do, and he gets a taste of your blood, it's over. And you won't stand a chance. Is there any way I can defeat him, even like?" He beckoned to himself. "This, you know, as a regular old human, you'll have to be clever," she murmured, standing up again. "But I think there is a way. It's going to be extremely dangerous, Izuku. I'll tell you in the car. If you're sure you want to go." He nodded his head confidently, standing up along with the shrine spirits to follow Kyoyuka outside. "Positive. Let's go save the shrine and your boyfriend," she added, poking her tongue out as she winked at Izuku's pink, blushing face. Tenya was holding up well against Stain, still managing to avoid getting cut by the Tengu. His rabbit ears and tail had come out once again as he focused and fought hard, trying to protect Shouto and throw in a few good kicks. Stain was just as quick, though, dodging each kick. Tenya swung at him with playful ease, a wild grin on his face like he was rather enjoying himself as one of Tenya's kicks slightly knocked into his legs. He stumbled backwards and cackled loudly. "Oh, you got me that time, bunny boy," he taunted as he regained his balance quickly, and then dove in again to try and slash his knives at Tenya. "Maybe a little harder next time, and you'll be able to actually cause some damage. Go to hell." Tenya grunted as he jumped to the side, just barely avoiding getting cut in the face as he felt the knife fly by his ear. "But hell is no fun." Stain grinned, then winked at the rabbit yokai. "You know, this is getting kind of boring too. Though how well can you dance around me and protect that kid?" With those words, he jumped back away from Tenya, then swiftly chucked one of the knives straight for Shouto, who was watching helplessly on the shrine steps. Tenya called out in alarm, struggling to turn and run for Shouto. But the small sharp knife had already flown past him. Shouto was ready, though, watching the fight carefully and cautiously, albeit feeling insecure of his current abilities. As soon as he saw Stain flick his wrist towards him, the knife flying straight for his face, he threw up his right hand and managed to create a small ice shield from his palm. The knife instantly shattered the shield of ice, but failed to reach Shouto as it dropped to the ground with a loud clang. As Shouto looked up again to the fighting yokai, his eyes widened in horror as he saw Stain come up behind Tenya. He screamed just as the rabbit yokai gracefully ducked down, swinging his right leg back and spinning his whole body along the floor to kick Stain to the ground. The Tengu let out a pained groan as he flew back, sliding hard on the floor. Wet gravel stuck to his body as he quickly got up, eyes narrowed in anger as he gritted his teeth. He grabbed another knife from his chest, slashing hard at Tenya. As the rabbit yokai came in for another attack, Tenya grabbed at his wounded arm, blood dripping from beneath his fingers. As he held down on the deep gash, Shouto expected the Tengu to take this opportunity to grab one of his feathers and perform the curse. But he felt shock and confusion as he instead watched Stain lick the knife's blade that had cut Tenya. Not even a second later, Tenya's body went stiff, frozen like time had been paused. The only thing moving were his eyes, looking around frantically, first to Stain and then towards Shouto. The fox yokai tried to form ice in his hands, feeling his body shake with sickness and panic. "I'm going to kill you, slow and painful, just like I did to your big brother," the crow yokai growled, marching up slowly towards Tenya. "But first, I'm going to make you watch me kill that kid." Stain spun around fast, sprinting with his chest towards the ground straight for Shouto. The small fox yokai managed to send out a thick layer of ice on the ground in front of him, just in time to make Stain slip and stumble, slamming face first into the hard ice. A couple of knives and his long sword dropped from him, but he didn't waste time picking them up as he got on his knees to carefully stand back up. Shouto used this moment to swiftly pick up the sword, then jump down the steps and run away from the shrine in hopes of keeping Stain away from the girls he thought were still hiding inside. "Get back here, you brat!" Stain roared, his face red and stinging from where had fallen on the ice. As Shouto ran, he threw patches of ice on the ground in hopes of at the very least slowing Stain down. From the looks of it, his wings were too destroyed for him to be capable of flying. But it didn't stop him from taking short leaps off of the ground. As he dodged the ice patches, his tattered wings keeping him airborne for a few extra seconds, Shouto made his way towards the shrine gates his own pace, slowing down as he had to avoid tripping over scattered tree branches and slippery leaves. He intended to follow through with his plan to lead Stain as far away from the shrine as possible. until suddenly Kyoka's expensive black car pulled up in front of him, tires squealing as she pulled over abruptly. No, he screamed as a familiar head of green hair jumped out of the car, yelling at Kyoka over his shoulder and telling her to leave before slamming the car door shut behind him. Get away from here. The yokai sobbed out, feeling both furious and wretched to see Izuku here. But Kyoka was already speeding away down the road. Izuku only glanced at Shouto's slight guilt on his face, before he suddenly looked much more intense, grabbing a thick branch on the ground and shoving the end of it right over Shouto's head. Shouto ducked, surprised to hear Stain let out a groan of pain directly behind him. He hadn't realized that Tengu had caught up to him so quickly. Stain rolled back, cursing angrily as he clutched his chest where Izuku hit him. Izuku, please leave, Shouto begged, desperately shoving at his legs, but the freckled boy only shook his head. Never, Izuku yelled at him, grabbing Shouto by the collar of his shirt and harshly moving him to the side, his green eyes large and alert. I could never leave you, trust me, Shouto, please. He tried to protest more, but Izuku interrupted him further. And get ready to use that sword, because I'm going to have to do something you're not going to like. What the fuck does that mean? Shouto shouted angrily and fearfully before watching in horror as Izuku ran directly at Stain. It looked so wrong watching the young man dash towards the large and bristling yokai. Stain almost towered him in size, with his huge midnight wings, torn scarf flowing behind him in the wind, and bigger body, holding himself with a ferocious intensity as he prepared himself to attack Izuku. Just as Stain pulled out a knife, Izuku pulled out one of his own from his hoodie pocket, a little larger and sharper than the one Stain held. Shouto felt his legs moving forward before he could even comprehend what was happening, watching in utter terror as Izuku and Stain stabbed each other at the same time. Izuku stabbed the knife right above Stain's armpit, missing his chest like he'd be aiming for. He hit Stain first, but was unable to block himself as Stain's own knife went into his side right below his ribs. Fighting through the searing pain, Izuku pulled the knife out hard and fast, dragging it down to open the wound further. He could barely hear Stain scream in pain as his own head pounded blindingly, his eyes closing as he felt hot wet liquid spraying out over the both of them. The knife in his side was quickly pulled out too, making Izuku sob out in agony like he'd never experienced before. Shouto watched in complete dread as the two stumbled away from each other, blood covering both of them. Stain was quick, bringing his blood-covered knife to his mouth and quickly sliding his tongue on the flat part of the blade. Just as he did so, Izuku fell to his knees, dropping the knife he held. His body suddenly went eerily still, hunched over awkwardly like a statue as blood continued to flow from his side. The fox yokai leapt in front of Izuku, holding the sword up and ready to block Stain's finishing blow. But it never came. He lowered his arms, peeking behind the long, shining blade, and then jerked back, a gasp escaping his throat. Stain stood frozen, his own eyes rolled back and white as his shoulder bled heavily, and his posture leaning forward, as if he was intended to attack. The bloodied knife was still at his lips, his tongue frozen against it. Shouto glanced back to Izuku, seeing he too was still frozen, but his eyes were looking directly at him. Somehow Izuku managed to trick Stain into tasting both Izuku's blood and his own. Get ready to use that sword, that's what Izuku had said, and Shouto understood. He stood below Stain, feeling a little creeped out by the Tenga's size compared to his own small childish body. With slightly trembling arms, he lifted the sword high above his head, then with as much strength as he could muster, he swung the sword down, cleanly beheading the evil Tengu. As soon as he heard the soft thud of Stain's head landing on the ground and his body collapsing with it, he also heard Izuku gasp out behind him, the curse lifting instantly. Shouto turned and sprinted for Izuku, arms outstretched, as he tried to hold the bleeding human against him. It was hard with Izuku so much bigger and heavier, and his legs wobbled as he tried to help Izuku sit up. Shouto came a roar from the direction of the shrine. Shouto's fox ears stood up, alert and listening, as he turned his head in the direction of the rabbit yokai's loud voice. He yelled as loud as he could towards the direction of the shrine, holding back a sob as he pleaded, over here, Tenya, and hurry, we need help. It only took a moment for Tenya to appear, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of Stain's decapitated body, and then Izuku's shaking, crumbled form. He rushed to Izuku, taking him off of Shouto and lifting him easily in his arms. Izuku was barely conscious, eyes not quite focusing on anything as he breathed in short, painful gasps. Tenya squatted down so that Shouto could grab a hold of his back, then made a mad dash for the shrine. They stumbled, and Shouto dropping himself gracefully off of Tenya's back, his little legs rushing for the bathroom. I'll run a bath for him. You need to summon the shrine spirits back and let them know it's safe here now, Shouto instructed, his voice oddly dull as he focused on getting the bath filled with hot water. Tenya nodded gravely, gently placing Izuku into the ceramic tub. He put a hand on Shouto's shoulder and then quickly left the bathroom to summon Ochako. And Tsuyu, what the hell is wrong with you? Shouto whispered angrily, his chest aching as he looked at Izuku's still form. His eyes were closed, his face scrunched in pain as he lay there bleeding and pale, unconscious. Now Shouto was quick to remove his clothing, gentle, especially where he was cut, to his relief. The wound wasn't too deep and didn't seem to hit any important organs, but his main concern was the amount of blood Izuku lost and was continuing to lose. He held a thick rag to the wound, putting as much pressure as his young body could to try and stop the bleeding. Now wasn't the time for embarrassment. But he still felt his face heat up as he avoided looking anywhere below Izuku's waist, while he tenderly cleaned Izuku with a wash rag with his other hand. If it's alright with you, 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗍 also like to summon a family friend of mine. She's a healing goddess, the best I know. And I promise you she can help your friend Tenya, said, peeking his head in the doorway. Shouto didn't turn back to look, but nodded his head as he put down the washcloth and began to stroke Izuku's hair slowly. I would be grateful, thank you, Tenya. Tenya watched for another second, his lips tight, but eyes so hat curious. Before hurrying away, there was sudden chatter from the other room, and Shouto knew that meant the girls were back. He held his breath, enjoying a few more seconds of quiet before they both came stumbling clumsily and loudly into the room, tears streaming down their faces as they leaned over the tub to look at Izuku. Shouto moved back, setting the dirty rags to the side. I know Tenya-sama said a healing god was coming, but it hurts so much to see Izuku this way. Ochako sobbed, fat tears rolling down her face as she clutched at Izuku's limp hand. Tsuyu put an arm around Shouto's shoulders, leaning her head against his. He's going to be okay, Kiro. She sniffled, quickly wiping away her own tears. I know, he said quietly, his mouth closed in a tight frown. And then he stood up, stepping back as he heard Tenya talking to someone in the other room. Ochako sent Tsuyu a concerned glance, but the frog-like girl shook her head. Shouto's face remained emotionless and straight, and he seemed to be avoiding eye contact with anyone. He stared at his hands, choosing to focus on them, rather than the unconscious young man in the bathtub. There was a polite knock, and then Tenya came in with a tiny old woman behind him. Despite her obviously ancient age, she glowed with warmth and life. Her shimmery silver hair was tied back in a tight bun, and she wore an extravagant white kimono that made her look even more pure and holy. She reached out a hand toward Shouto, and he felt too enraptured by the woman's presence to pull away just by the simple touch of her hand to his cheek. He felt his fever and headache that had been fighting back instantly vanish. He couldn't help the sigh of relief that escaped his mouth. Your friend is going to be just fine, relax, young fox. Though maybe not as young as you look, she smiled kindly. Her eyes almost looked closed as her wrinkles raised around her smiling cheeks. Shouto gave her a small smile back, then watched the goddess make her way over to Izuku. Poor thing, she cooed, sitting herself down beside the tub. He must have been very brave. Shouto bit his lip, afraid his voice would betray him, so he only nodded quickly. The old goddess leaned forward, her lips puckering out and stretching to reach Izuku's temple. With a loud smooch, she kissed him sweetly on the head, then stood back. The two yokai and two shrine spirits watched in fascination as Izuku began to light up, glowing and glistening with strong magic. His face relaxed, a small calm smile on his lips. As the color returned to his skin and the painful cut on his side vanished, all that remained of it was a simple scar. Hell still be passed out for another half hour or so, but once he awakens, hell be good, as new the goddess assured them before making her leave Shouto. And the girls hurried after her, following her out of the bathroom. The girls each took one of her hands and kissed them respectfully. Thank you for helping him, of course, she nodded, patting their heads like they were her grandchildren. Have a blessed life, you three. She looked over to Shouto, nodding her head as he bowed low, and in thanks the goddess turned back to Tenya, giving him a quick peck on the cheek before she vanished in a puff of glittery silver smoke. He too seemed rejuvenated, standing straighter as he felt his energy and health fresh again. Tenya approached Shouto as the small yokai straightened up. I'd like to apologize, Shouto. I took advantage of your friend you and Mama-sama. I was thinking selfishly, and in the process, I almost got Izuku Midoriya killed. He got onto his knees and bowed his head against the wooden floor. Not asking for your forgiveness, as I don't deserve it. But I ask that y'all at least accept my apology. If there is anything I could do to repay you two, do not hesitate to ask me. Shouto knelt down beside the rabbit yokai, putting a hand on his head. Stand, Tenya, be the proud yokai that Mama-sama so greatly admired. Tenya sat up, looking down at Shouto with a humble, sad expression. The lucky mallet is hidden below the shrine. If one of the girls gets it, then Izuku can turn you back. When he wakes up, he brought his hand to his forehead, removing the land god mark from himself, and please give this back to him. He deserves to be this shrine's god. More than I ever will. Ochako accepted the mark, holding the glowing sphere in the palm of her hands with the utmost care. Tenya stood, then offered a hand to Shouto to help lift him up as well. He surprised the fox by pulling him into his arms and hugging him tight. Shouto's eyes widened and cheeks turned pink as he awkwardly stiffened. Thank you both for saving my life and ending the life of that monsters. I'm so sorry. I dragged you all into this. Tenya's voice boomed loudly, dropping Shouto roughly, and then he moved to give the shrine spirits softer hugs. The girls called out goodbyes while Shouto watched the rabbit yokai leave in silence. Once Tenya was gone, the two girls hurried back to the bathroom to give Izuku the mark, clean up the disheveled bathroom up a bit, and to watch over the human god until he woke. Shouto stayed back, choosing to sit on the couch and wait there until Izuku was awake. He laid back against the back of the sofa, holding his hands neatly in his lap, his short legs a few inches off the floor. His eyes tried to close despite the healing goddess touch. He still felt incredibly exhausted from everything that occurred over the last day. But he fought it, keeping them open the best he could. He could rest once Izuku was awake, and things were good again once he could hear Izuku's voice, and know for sure that he really was okay. Izuku blinked into the soft light of the bathroom above him, his vision blurred from the steam of the hot water, and from his mind, not yet clearing up fully. He breathed slow, and even becoming more aware of his senses. Besides his slightly chilly and damp head, he was comfortably warm, submerged in hot water from his collarbone all the way to his toes. There was whispering nearby, his mind clearing up just enough that he thought to turn his head and look at who was with him. When he turned and made eye contact with Tsuyu, he came to the sudden realization that he was very naked, and very much not alone. He shrieked out in embarrassment, splashing about in the water. As he threw his hands down to cover his lower region, Tsuyu only grinned, looking very pleased to see him, while Ochako giggled, sweetly amused, and not at all ashamed to be with him like Izuku felt. Ochako grabbed a towel and brought it towards Izuku, an adoring smile on her lips and cheeks rosy with happiness. "We're so happy to see you," she exclaimed as she offered the towel. "Here, so you'll feel more comfortable." "Thank you," he muttered, taking the towel, but staying below the water. The girls watched him, waiting expectantly for him to get up. But he looked down at himself, a small pout on his face. Could you guys turn around for a second?" "Sure," Ochako replied innocently, while Tsuyu added over her shoulder, "It's not like we haven't seen male genitals before, Kiro." "But okay." He made another awkward squeaking sound as they laughed. But once he was sure they weren't watching, he stood up from the water and quickly dried himself with the fluffy white towel, wrapping it around his waist and tying it securely. As he glanced in the mirror, seeing his bright, healthy-looking face in his reflection, he suddenly remembered the events from earlier and quickly looked down, pleasantly surprised to see himself completely fine and unharmed. "You were healed by a very powerful healing god," Ochako pointed out, turning back and noticing Izuku's surprise. "Tenya has left already. But in case you haven't noticed yet, you're the land god again." Before he could reply and ask more questions, the two shrine spirits bowed their heads. "We're honored to be serving you again, Izuku-sama." He felt his eyes water as he smiled gratefully. "You guys, I don't want you calling me that. And Tenya left this for you as well, so that you can turn Shouto back to his adult body," Tsuyu croaked, lifting up a large golden hammer he hadn't even noticed was in the bathroom with them. "It's the lucky mallet of the great All Might. Simply swing it towards Shouto, and he'll be back to his normal self." "Where is Shouto?" Izuku asked, taking the mallet, carefully admiring its fine craftsmanship and heavy weight. "Here," came a soft voice from the doorway. Shouto had a hint of a smile on his lips. He looked tired, but also well, and most importantly, he was alive. Izuku felt his shoulders drop in relief, smiling brightly as he spoke to the small fox yokai. "I'm so glad you're okay. I was so worried when the girls showed up, and then they said you were in danger, and I had to do something." And Shouto stepped forward, arms crossed over his chest. "Izuku," he pouted, "can you please hurry up and change me back?" "Oh," he cried, flushing softly. "Of course. Sorry." After checking his towel was secure first, as he really wanted to avoid flashing everyone, he then lifted the heavy hammer above his head, feeling the land god's strength surging through his arms as he swung it down, careful not to drop it from the force. Smoke and glittery dust filled the small bathroom, making Izuku and the girls cough and choke as they struggled to breathe or see through the heavy fog. As the smoke began to clear, Izuku's jaw dropped. Shouto stood tall, a soft smile on his beautiful scarred face, as he looked in contentment at his strong, long arms, examining himself to make sure he was truly back to normal. The kimono that appeared on him was lengthy and almost too big, draping down over his forearms and shoulders, and revealing his toned chest, slender neck, and smooth skin. But what astonished Izuku the most was Shouto's hair. It was long, flowing elegantly behind him and down his shoulders, all the way down to the back of his knees, his right side the same brilliant white, and the left side that striking red. Izuku felt breathless, gaping as he blushed at the gorgeous yokai, who seemed more than content to be himself again. He dropped the mallet to the side, barely noticing the heavy hammer clanged on the floor. "Your hair," he stuttered, bringing his hands to his cheeks, as he marveled. Shouto hummed, as if just noticing it, taking a thick strand between his fingers as he combed it casually. "It's long again. I see. I'll have to take care of that soon." But first the yokai walked towards Izuku, his chest almost level with the blushing boy's face. He stood too close, and brought a hand up to grab Izuku by the chin. Izuku was too dumbfounded for words, gaping at Shouto, as the fox tilted his head slightly, sharp eyes narrowing as he bent down closer and looked into Izuku's wide emerald eyes. "Don't you ever do anything that stupid again, Izuku-sama." He growled, his soft lips just a breath away from Izuku's. Before Izuku could apologize, he felt the tip of Shouto's nose tickle his, and then a cold breath invading his mouth, stealing the air right out of him. One of Shouto's hands, the warm one, reached out and held the back of Izuku's head tenderly, his nails lightly scraping and pulling on his slightly damp, unruly hair as he brought Izuku closer, their mouths locking and chests bumping. A deep shiver ran down Izuku's spine and he couldn't quite hold back the pleasant noise that came from the back of his throat as he leaned into Shouto, his own lips opening and head moving forward to get a better angle. Everything was warm and wet as their lips moved in sync, except Shouto's cool tongue that quickly slid in, just barely running along Izuku's lips right before he pulled away quicker than Izuku would have liked. He was left breathless, his face and neck a rosy shade as his dark eyelashes blinked quickly, and he had to resist whining as he felt Shouto's grip in his hair loosen. The yokai coughed, looking away, and then back at Izuku. So you're familiar again. Right, the familiar contract was sealed by a kiss. Izuku didn't have time to feel disappointed by the thought, though, as he felt Shouto's hand, that was still lightly holding the back of his head, start to move away. His hand trailed down Izuku's neck, his long fingers delicately tracing down to Izuku's collarbone. Izuku blushed harder under Shouto's heavy gaze before the yokai's eyes dropped lower, and then instantly shot back up, his mismatched eyes wide and pupils dilating also. "You should probably so close," and the words came out rushed, blurted out with an embarrassed pink flush on his cheeks, as he then practically ran out of the bathroom, his extravagant hair swiftly moving behind him. Izuku was dazed. He let out a trembling lovesick sigh, his fingers coming to his lips. Where Shouto had kissed him, he could still taste him on his lips, euphoric by the moment. It took a solid minute for Shouto's words to take meaning. But then Izuku looked down at his naked, uncovered self. The towel lay at his feet almost mockingly, and Izuku felt his entire body turn bright red. When did the towel drop? He let out a horrified scream, his arms flailing about, as the observing shrine spirits didn't even bother to hold in their laughter. "Kill me, please," he cried over their hysterical cackling. For the following few days, something about Izuku felt off. Shouto stood in the garden basking in the warm sunlight. As he contently raked at the scattered leaves, his mismatched eyes flickered over to where Izuku sat on the back porch, nose deep in one of Shouto's prayer journals. Something in his chest warmed at the sight. The young man with his tameless green hair, so relaxed, content, and exactly where he belonged after the whole situation with Tenya that included Izuku bravely and stupidly risking himself for all of them. There wasn't a single doubt in his mind that Izuku deserved more than anyone else to be the land god, and for being once considered a wild fox, Shouto felt more comfortable with his life than he ever had before. Even if Mama-sama suddenly appeared to reclaim the shrine, Shouto, if given the option, would still choose Izuku, and that was a startling thought. But something about Izuku made Shouto feel so safe, so at ease. For the first time in his life, he could say he was truly content with how things were, even though Izuku definitely seemed eager to be back at the shrine. Even going out of his way to chat with a visitor the day before, when he had been in the middle of other duties, something about him just seemed uncomfortable in a way different than before. Shouto followed him around closely, sometimes intentionally, and sometimes not, but he was just so drawn to Izuku, drawn to how hard he worked, and how determined he was about every task. He was always so expressive, the emotions on his face easy to read like an open book, something Shouto liked about Izuku. And he found himself staring often. It also helped that Izuku was attractive, not like Shouto would admit it to himself. Yet whenever Izuku noticed Shouto observing him, head turn red, and sometimes even move away. Just then, as Shouto stood there admiring the view, green eyes flickered up from behind the journal. Shouto continued to stare, a small smile naturally forming on his lips, as it tended to do lately around the freckled man. Izuku, however, quickly looked back at the journal, his relaxed disposition vanishing. As his shoulders tensed, cheeks turned pink, and fingers gripped the journal so hard his knuckles were turning white, Shouto frowned, gathered his long hair to move it back over his shoulders, and then approached Izuku somewhat cautiously. "Are you all right, Izuku?" he asked, his eyebrows creased in worry, a few strands of red hair falling forward as he leaned over Izuku. "Your face is all red." "What?" Izuku yelped, lifting the worn journal higher to conceal his face, as he nervously stuttered, "Not blushing, fine, don't mind me." He got up, turning quickly to run into the shrine, but his socks slipped on the smooth wooden floor, his eyes shut tight as he prepared himself for a painful and embarrassing face plant into the bamboo. But it never came as Shouto lunged forward to grab him. The yokai moved fast and graceful, grabbing Izuku by the arm and using his falling momentum to spin him backwards and right into Shouto's arms. With one arm, he pulled Izuku closer, holding him gently against his chest, while his other cooler hand came up to feel Izuku's forehead. He had to resist laughing at Izuku's skittish expression. "I can feel your heart racing," Shouto pointed out with a sly smirk, "and you're burning up. I think you have a fever, Izuku. Ah ha ha ha." Izuku laughed anxiously, face turning somehow redder as he gave a nervous grin. Fine, Shouto began to protest, but Izuku put a firm hand on the yokai's chest to push himself away. "Really, fine, Izuku," the yokai sighed doubtfully, his hand reaching out to follow Izuku as he moved back. "Please, at least let me check your temperature." Izuku avoided his hand, moving away quickly, as if it was a hot object that could burn him. Shouto frowned. It was his right side, so there's no way he could burn Izuku with that hand. Seeing Shouto's expression fall, Izuku gave a small smile and stepped back towards him. He reached up to fix a long strand of hair that hung in front of Shouto's eyes, his touch light and gentle. It made Shouto's tail twitch pleasantly, which made Izuku's eyes light up in a way that sent Shouto's own heart rate racing. His hands came up again to grab for Izuku, But he turned back towards the shrine, mumbling over his shoulder, "Ugh, okay, I'll let you check. But I swear I'm not sick." "This is unnecessary," Izuku groaned as Shouto sat him down on the couch. Beside the girls, they looked up curiously, Tsuyu tilting her head like a puppy as Shouto explained. "I believe Izuku might have a fever. I'll be right back with a thermometer." Izuku watched him leave the room, his lips pouting in disagreement. He waited till Shouto was gone before quickly turning to the girls. "This is ridiculous. You guys know I'm not sick. Maybe lovesick." Tsuyu winked, wagging her index finger at the land god 𝗧𝗂𝗧𝗧. Izuku hid his burning face behind his hands, the shrine girls giggling sweetly beside him. "You guys don't know how bad it's been since he, Every time he looks at me, my head gets dizzy. And when he touches me, it feels like my heart is just going to, I don't know, explode." "What's going to explode?" Shouto frowned. As he re-entered the room, "Prince Katsuki isn't coming anytime soon, right? He's still too busy pretending to be human, I'm assuming." "Izuku," the girls said in unison. As the man in question blurted out, "Nothing." "Why is Izuku going to explode?" Shouto asked in confusion, unsure if they were actually serious or trying to make some kind of joke at the young god. "No reason," he replied a little too loudly before the girls could say anything else. Shouto narrowed his eyes at the three suspiciously, then shrugged and knelt down in front of Izuku. "Open your mouth, please," he said softly, lifting the plastic thermometer up to Izuku's lips. He obeyed, although refused to look at the red and white-haired yokai, as he accepted the thermometer and let it sit underneath his tongue. Izuku was dying ever since Shouto had kissed him in the bathroom. It was like the yokai couldn't stay away from him. And while normally Izuku loved every second spent with Shouto, he was feeling a little overwhelmed by his endearing presence and distractingly beautiful long hair. It wasn't fair. Shouto was acting like everything was normal, and like he hadn't kissed Izuku, absolutely senseless, just to seal the familiar contract. But yet at the same time, there was no denying that something changed in the fox. Throughout the day, Izuku would catch Shouto staring at him, or when they were close, Shouto would absent-mindedly do things like play with Izuku's hair or grab his arms or touch the small of his back. All of it was wonderful. In fact, Izuku loved the attention. But it seemed like Shouto didn't even realize he was doing it. If Izuku got flustered by Shouto's touches or warm gazes, he acted confused or concerned. And now the stupid yokai even thought he was sick, when in reality he was just sick of Shouto being so adorable and not being able to do anything about it. There were too many occurrences where Izuku had to physically leave the room before he could lose control and grab Shouto by the collar of his shirt just to kiss him once again. He imagined it too often. But the thought was terrifying. He was unclear if Shouto even felt anything for him. After all, he was still a human, and it was most likely that Shouto was just happy to have Izuku as the shrine's god again. The thermometer beeped, interrupting Izuku's frustrating thoughts. Shouto pulled it out, examined it, then made a small tch sound with his tongue. He turned it around to show Izuku the very high temperature, his face looking completely unimpressed as Izuku gaped at it. "I knew you were sick," he sighed, setting the thermometer on the coffee table. "I'll change your sheets, and then I urge that you spend the day resting in bed." As he got up to leave, Izuku followed and tried to pull him away from his room. "Maybe it's wrong, really, Shouto. I feel fine. Plus, I have to work today." "Not with a fever like that, you aren't," Shouto said fiercely, stopping in the middle of the hallway to turn and scoop Izuku up. He carried a very flushed Izuku back to the couch, bridal style. And besides a strange squeaking sound, Izuku was uncharacteristically quiet the short trip there. He tried to ignore Shouto's warm, hard chest, his clean, almost floral smell, along with a hint of smokiness from his fireside, and the way he could feel his arms tightening to hold him even closer and more securely. Shouto dropped Izuku down gently, his body bouncing on the cushions, as the yokai hurried away to do his task. Ochako leaned onto Izuku, wiggling her eyebrows suggestively at him. "I'm going to explode, Ochako-chan," he hissed. "I literally feel like I might die. You better get work figured out," she smirked, "because I don't think Master Shouto is going to allow you to go today." "I need to though," he groaned, pulling his hair back. "Kayuka's having a concert this weekend, so there's a ton to do to get the stadium ready for it. Everyone is already scheduled, and Mr. Aizawa would kill me if I called in sick." "Is Master Shouto scheduled to work?" Tsuyu asked thoughtfully. Izuku shook his head. Shouto had only worked a handful of times, usually when someone else needed a shift covered, and asked Izuku if Shouto wanted to come in with him. He didn't even work enough to be considered part-time and had never worked a shift without Izuku there as well. Imagining Shouto working at the stadium on his own felt kind of weird to Izuku. But he supposed it wouldn't hurt to ask. He excused himself from the shrine spirits, then made his way out of the living room and down the hall. It was hard not to notice the way he swayed as he walked, his face feeling warm, and he knew for a fact he wasn't blushing then. Guess he was ill after all, Izuku sighed. He rarely got sick, and whenever he did it felt incredibly inconvenient, as he just wanted to be productive. "Hey Shouto," he called out, poking his head into the bedroom to find the yokai fluffing up Izuku's pillows. Shouto looked up, his expression soft in the dimly lit room. He looked so handsome. His hair was now tied into a low side ponytail that hung over his left shoulder, the red and whites blending subtly. The yukata he wore was a deep burgundy one that made his skin look even more pale and delicate in the dark. Izuku felt himself swallow, forgetting momentarily what he was going to say as he watched Shouto turn back to the bed and finish laying things out. After smoothing out the bumps on a blanket, the red and white-haired fox yokai turned and approached Izuku, who still stood at the door. "You're spacing off," he commented, gently grabbing Izuku by the shoulder, and then pushed him towards the bed. "Come rest." "But I have to work soon," he protested, attempting to plant his feet in the ground, but Shouto was stronger. The yokai shook his head, pushing Izuku into the bed. "I already called your boss. I let him know you were sick. And he asked if I'd be able to work your shift. I accepted." Izuku opened his mouth, but Shouto put a finger to his lips to silence him. "It's fine, really. I don't mind. I have pretty much all of my duties here done for the day anyways." He pulled the blankets up and tucked Izuku in, making sure the land god was warm and cozy. Izuku let out a pleasant sigh as Shouto brought a cold hand to his cheek, feeling relief at the cool touch to his burning face. Part of him wanted to pull Shouto into the bed with him and snuggle up with him, kind of like they had the night of the storm. But he now wasn't an appropriate time, and Shouto really did have to get going. Shouto said goodbye, patting Izuku's head a little stiffly, then hurried off to his own room to change, and then head for the stadium to work Izuku's shift. It was quiet at the stadium. As it appeared Shouto had shown up before anyone else. He knew Mr. Aizawa was somewhere in the building as they'd passed in the hall, but they didn't speak to one another. Both were more than happy to simply nod their heads at each other in greeting. Shouto entered the break room, feeling a little more grateful that he was the only one there, as the supply closet was tight. A small square mirror hung next to the hanging schedule, and after checking for where Izuku was assigned for the day, he stopped to look at his reflection. First noticing the ugly gray polo, he sympathized with Izuku, who was constantly complaining about how hideous of a uniform it was. He had to agree, as the dull gray color only made his skin look even paler than it already was. Shouto remembered his first day working beside, and when Izuku had complimented him, the memory making him blush slightly. Seeing his reflection blushing only made him blush more as he brought a hand up in slight awe to touch his warm cheeks. It was weird to see such a soft expression on himself, so he began to glare at himself in prideful embarrassment. To busy himself a bit, he tied his hair up and back into a low ponytail that hung comfortably along his back. This way, it could be out of the way while he worked. Just as he felt his flat head by patting himself with both hands, the fox ears temporarily missing, the door opened. "Hey, Shouto," the black-haired human Hanto greeted, his smile widening into a large friendly grin. "Nice to see you, man. Where's the little green dude?" "Green dude?" Shouto frowned, lowering his hands from his head as he moved back to let the other man see his work schedule. "Izuku." He laughed, putting a hand up to represent Izuku's height. "You know about this tall, lots of freckles, award-winning smile." "Oh," Shouto swallowed. "He's sick with a fever. I made him stay home to rest." "That's good. I can see him overworking himself. He just seems like that kind of guy, doesn't know when to quit." The yokai nodded his head in agreement. He most definitely did know that Izuku was that way, so he was more than happy to come and do his silly human job for him. If it meant he got to rest a little, he excused himself from the black-haired man, still unable to recall his name. But as he opened the door to leave, he bumped into Mina and Denki. "Shouto and Hanta," the two exclaimed in surprising excitement. "Hello," Shouto said curtly, moving back to let them move past him so that he could exit. But of course they stood right where they were in the doorway like eager puppies. They greeted him, chatting away at how great it is to see you, and "Aw, that's too bad that Izuku isn't feeling well." Suddenly Hanta spoke up from behind him. "Whoa, Shouto, sick hair." Mina practically dove over him to get a look herself, while Denki shoved himself past the flustered yokai to see as well. He whispered loudly, and Mina shrieked, "Where did you get these extensions?" She picked up the ponytail in one hand, her other hand combing through it with her dark long fingers. "Your hair looks beautiful, Shouto." "Oh my god, what does Izuku think of it?" "He likes it, I think," he replied, face heating up again, so he quickly moved away so that his hair dropped from her hands. "Thank you." The three chattered loudly, clearly trying to include Shouto in their conversation, but he did his best to remain more of a listener than converser. With the four of them packed tightly like sardines in a can, he was stuck against a wall, thankfully close to the door. He could feel his social battery for the day already running low, so he cut Denki off of his rant about "I wish my roommates would work my shifts for me to say goodbye," and then he speed walked for the elevators. As he pressed the button to close the doors, Mina's high voice yelled out, "Catch that door, please." He obeyed, resisting the urge to roll his eyes, and allowed Mina to jump into the elevator beside him. She thanked him, her genuine gratefulness and overall positive attitude making him smile subtly. Her bright pink hair bounced as she spoke. Shouto watched it in fascination before realizing Mina was talking to him, as he was the only other person in the elevator. Her hands clapped together loudly, her plastic neon bracelets clinking together, echoing slightly over the jazzy elevator music that played quietly in the background. "And so you agree, yeah?" she finished with a cheeky smile, giving Shouto an obvious wink. "Ooh, sure." he replied, hoping he didn't make a huge mistake in agreeing to whatever it was she was talking about. Turns out he had made a mistake, as Mina was more than delighted with his answer, jumping closer to Shouto and practically trapping him into the corner seriously. Ugh, why don't you just ask Izuku out then? Wait, what? Shouto froze, giving Mina a confused glare that only made her laugh ridiculously hard. I was saying that Izuku is so sweet, and it's weird that he's so single, especially when he has such a kissable face. She grinned mischievously, holding her breath, yet again to see Shouto's reaction, all knowing that he wasn't paying any attention the first time. He gulped. With a strange urgency, he felt himself using his right side in a controlled, but almost anxious way to keep himself cool, to keep his face from giving anything away. Kissable face, oh god, didn't he know it? There was no denying that his kiss with Izuku, only to seal the familiar contract of course, was quite a bit more enjoyable than he expected, and he may have indulged himself just a little. Far more than it was appropriate for a familiar. He found himself tempted to taste the land god's lips once again. He needed to focus on the girl in front of him, though keep the strong poker face he knew he had. But it was too late, as a little blush creeped its way onto his porcelain cheeks, and the pink-haired woman in front of him was enjoying every damn second of it. Seriously, Shouto, ask him out. I can't, he muttered, thinking only to himself, he's human. There's no way. This is an impossible question, and impossible thoughts, please just stop. Yes, you can. She insisted, pumping her fist encouragingly. It's not like head say no, I mean Izuku is like head over heels in love with you, so really you have nothing to lose. The elevator dinged, its doors opening smoothly, but neither moved. Shouto gaped at Mina, his mouth open in shock and eyes unblinking. She stared right back, her grin fading as realization dawned on her. Her hand shot up, covering her mouth, but it was too late, as the words had already been said. You didn't know. She gawked, backing away towards the elevator exit. Izuku is in love with me, he whispered, voice slightly trembling. Mina cringed, clutching her uniform polo shirt, as she gave Shouto an apologetic wince. Oops. Then she turned and ran, the doors closing behind her, as the yokai stood pale from inside the elevator, watching her go. Frost began to form on his fingertips, and little patches of ice glinted from his left cheek and the side of his neck. Slowly, he fell to the floor, squatting down and holding his head in his hands. His voice came out frail, cracking and torn as he whispered again, but this time with certainty, Izuku's in love with me.